Chapter 1. The Admission Letter. On the second floor of 128 King's Road, in the heart of Kensington, Chelsea, Sherlock Holmes waited in his master bedroom. Normally, the day's correspondence arrived downstairs, left in the hall, or handed to Mrs. Hudson by the postman. Yet today brought something entirely out of the ordinary. A black and white Eurasian eagle owl had swooped through the open window, carrying a single envelope in its talons. It circled the spacious room once, then, without a feather out of place, dropped the letter directly into Sherlock's waiting hand before perching calmly on his clothes rack as if it owned the place. Sherlock raised an eyebrow. The envelope bore an oddly specific address. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, second floor, master bedroom, 128 King's Road. No ordinary postman would send a letter so precisely. No one could expect the delivery to find its way through locked doors and shuttered windows. And yet, here it was. He examined the envelope more closely. The seal was dark red wax, deeply impressed with a shield-shaped crest. Curiosity sparkled in Holmes's eyes. With a practiced flick of his penknife, he sliced the silk ribbon, binding the flap. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the parchment within. Whatever lay on that paper promised to be as extraordinary as its arrival. Sherlock's mind raced with possibilities, each more thrilling than the last. He leaned back in his chair, ready to plunge into the mystery that had literally flown to his doorstep. A new envelope lay on the desk, its seal more striking than any Sherlock had seen in months. Embossed in the center was a bold capital H, ringed by a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake. Though the space was tight, each creature was rendered in such exquisite detail that they seemed ready to spring from the paper. Sherlock reached for his magnifying glass, his gray eyes lighting up as he studied every line and shadow. A slight tremor betrayed his excitement. Despite his outward calm, he was anything but composed. At last, he threw back his head and laughed aloud. Finally, something worth my time. It's been far too quiet on the criminal front lately. It was 1991, a pivotal moment in Europe's history. As the European Union pressed ahead with deeper economic and political integration, its member states hurried to keep pace. Rumors swirled that, before the year's end, treaties formalizing both the European Economic and Monetary Union and the European Political Union would be signed. Britain, eager to reclaim a measure of its former imperial grandeur and to outshine its chief rivals France and Germany, had intensified efforts to maintain law and order at home, determined that stability would underpin its role on the continental stage. In late 20th century Britain, the great criminal syndicates had all but disappeared. Only the most stubborn street gangs still dared to operate. London, as the nation's capital, was the first to bear the full weight of the crackdown. Under relentless pressure, even those gangs had lowered their flags and gone quiet. Sherlock Holmes, freshly recovered from a serious illness, found himself caught in the lull. His parents had enrolled him at a preparatory school, and the prospect of spending his days waiting for term to begin was nothing short of intolerable for a boy who lived for excitement. Every idle hour felt like an eternity. Then, this morning, something arrived to break the monotony. Despite the thrill that fluttered in his chest, Sherlock treated the envelope with his customary care. He turned it over in his hands, noting each detail as if it were a clue at a crime scene: the lack of a postage stamp, the rich emerald green ink used for the address, the parchment finish of the paper, its unusually heavy weight. Intriguing. He allowed himself a small smile. His observations had already yielded a few hypotheses. Now he simply needed to confirm them by reading the letter itself. With practiced gentleness, he broke the seal and unfolded the thick sheet. At the top, in a graceful yet confident script, he read, "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Muggle-born, from the desk of the Principal, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Albus Dumbledore, Supreme Mugwump, Grand Sorcerer, First Class with Honors, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot." Beneath that heading, the body of the letter began, "Dear Mr. Holmes." Sherlock's pulse quickened. Finally, a mystery worthy of his talents was coming his way. Sherlock Holmes stared at the parchment in his hand, his keen eyes tracing each elegant stroke of green ink. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on September 1st. We await your owl by July 31st. Sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Before opening the letter, Sherlock had considered every possible outcome. An invitation to a scientific conference, a military commission, even a summoning from Scotland Yard, but never this. A school for witchcraft and wizardry? Grand sorcerers? His logical mind balked at the very notion. He flipped the page and found a second sheet, a meticulously itemized supply list. Wands of Holly and Phoenix Feather. Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, by Miranda Goshawk. A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. A cauldron, a set of glass phials, robes embroidered with the Hogwarts crest. Items plucked straight from the pages of fantasy novels, nothing more. And yet the list had been assembled with the precision of a court summons. After a long, silent moment, Sherlock held the parchment up to the gaslight. The ink remained flawless, the paper impossibly fine. He tapped it lightly against his palm, then let out a low, sharp laugh. Ha! His eyes, usually cold and calculating, glinted with something like wonder. If it had been any other child, he thought, they'd have dropped everything and believed without question. But Sherlock Holmes was not just any child. 11-year-old Sherlock Holmes was no ordinary child. He was astonishingly mature for his age and a staunch believer in science. Magic, he knew, belonged only in fairy tales, so this mysterious letter simply had to be a prank. He examined the envelope with cool detachment. The heavy paper and embossed seal were impressive, but easily forged. The letter's contents could be concocted in an afternoon. Even his own address would be trivial to invent. The only oddity was the owl that had delivered it. He'd never heard of using owls for postal service. Pigeons were the norm, but absence of precedent did not prove impossibility. He knew that a determined prankster with time and resources could train a bird. Would anyone really go to such lengths to hoodwink him? Given what he'd already witnessed, Sherlock was certain the answer was yes. This was hardly the first extravagant stunt he'd encountered. After all, he'd grown up with grand dreams, like becoming a pirate, a fanciful ambition perhaps, but one woven into the very fabric of his country's storied traditions. One afternoon, during an otherwise unremarkable stretch, Sherlock found a letter waiting for him. At first glance, it resembled the acceptance letters he'd seen before, but this one had arrived by an ordinary postman. Inside was a proclamation signed by Jack Sparrow, yes, the Jack Sparrow, who claimed to have once ruled the seas as a daring pirate captain. According to the letter, Sparrow and his crew had lived by the old creed, steal from the rich to aid the poor. His name alone was enough to send rival captains scurrying below decks. Unfortunately, Sparrow went on. A treacherous rival outwitted him and seized his beloved ship. Stripped of his vessel and fortune, he was forced ashore, destitute and heartbroken. Desperate to reclaim what he'd lost, Jack Sparrow had searched for a worthy successor, someone with the wit, courage, and unconventional thinking to master the pirate's life and take vengeance on the scoundrel who had betrayed them both. To his astonishment, he found that person in Sherlock Holmes. Sparrow's letter proposed an apprenticeship. He would teach Sherlock the art of piracy, navigation, swordplay, even the subtle tactics of sea warfare, and together they would hunt down the villainous captain and recover Sparrow's stolen ship. Unsurprisingly, Sherlock's first response was refusal. After all, he was a detective, not a pirate. But Jack Sparrow was nothing if not persuasive. Over the following weeks, he proved his identity and abilities in a series of daring demonstrations, sending cryptic riddles, secret maps, and even a single gold doubloon stamped with his personal crest. Slowly, against his better judgment, Sherlock's curiosity and respect began to grow. For it would take a truly extraordinary mind to earn the trust of Sherlock Holmes, and Jack Sparrow had clearly succeeded. Throughout the entire process, Sherlock rigorously tested and rechecked every detail, yet he found no flaws. Everything seemed impeccably in order. At last, he allowed himself to believe in the adventure that awaited alongside Jack Sparrow. Then came the crushing announcement. It was all a hoax. The revelation struck him like a thunderbolt. Sherlock drew in a steadying breath and reminded himself of a simple truth. You never stumble twice in the same way. His deductive faculties, sharpened by experience, were now stronger than ever, and he promised himself he would not be so easily deceived again. Common sense told him that owls don't carry letters. Yet his recent lesson in gullibility made him realize that nothing was impossible if someone had devoted enough time and effort to train one. Clearly, someone had taken malicious pleasure in toying with his emotions. Lost in thought, Sherlock paced the length of his study, replaying every moment of the deception. At last, he reached a decision. Grabbing a fresh sheet of paper, he set to work, his pen flying across the page as he prepared his next move. Dear Professor McGonagall, thank you for your acceptance letter. It is an honor to be invited to your distinguished school, and I would be delighted to attend. However, neither my family nor I have any knowledge of the magical world, and we are uncertain about the preparations required for enrollment. I would greatly appreciate it if a member of your staff could visit us to answer our questions. Sincerely, Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock set down his quill and allowed himself a faint, contemplative smile. He had insisted on this little exchange for the promise of excitement, and now that the first move had been made, he intended to see it through. No sooner had he finished sealing the parchment than the owl, still perched on his coat rack, gave a triumphant hoot, spread its wings, and swooped toward him. He held out his hand, and with a swift, practiced motion, the bird snatched the letter between its talons. In a blur of feathers and purpose, it shot toward the open window and disappeared into the evening sky. Sherlock watched its flight with undisguised admiration. The bird's precise posture and speed spoke of careful, dedicated training. Whoever was behind this gesture would not be content to let the matter rest, and neither would he. Sherlock paced the length of his sitting room, turning over possibilities in his mind. How might his correspondent respond? Would they try to earn his trust with carefully worded letters? Send an agent masquerading as a magic school tutor? Or simply burst in, accuse him of fraud, and expose the whole thing as a hoax? That last option seemed unlikely. After all, both parties wanted this contest to continue. Whatever the next move was, Sherlock couldn't help feeling a thrill of anticipation. At least this summer promised to be anything but dull. He hadn't expected an answer so soon. Just 3 days after he'd received the acceptance letter, Sherlock found himself at the breakfast table with his parents. Mrs. Holmes, glancing at the morning paper, let out a sharp exclamation. "Tannen, listen to this. The home invasion case has finally been closed. Sherlock was right all along. The culprit really was that one-armed man, Mr. Holmes Law." Uffed and looked across the table at his son. That was, 3 months ago now? Sherlock tore off a piece of toast and chewed thoughtfully. "That's the Metropolitan Police for you," he said coolly. "Scotland Yard's reputation for slowness is well earned. They tend to miss the obvious while chasing distractions." He sank back into his chair, already wondering how and when the next move in this strange game would arrive. Scotland Yard isn't in Scotland, nor does it police that country. It's simply the nickname for the Metropolitan Police Service, the force charged with maintaining public order and regulating traffic throughout Greater London, excluding only the square mile of the City of London. From 1829 until 1890, the Met was headquartered at 4 Whitehall Place. Because one of its back doors opened onto a narrow street called Scotland Yard, the name gradually came to stand for the entire service. This practice, using a location as shorthand for an institution, crops up all the time in Britain, Fleet Street, 10 Downing Street, and elsewhere. Even Holmes's young companion Sherlock is well acquainted with such metonyms: the Lubyanka, the Six Fan Gates, the Seaburg Grand Hotel. Mr. Holmes listened thoughtfully as Sherlock outlined the origins of the Yard's name. When his son finished, he smiled and said, "You know, Sherlock, you'd make an excellent detective one day." Sherlock merely arched an eyebrow in response, offering no more than a silent acknowledgement. Just then, a great Eurasian eagle owl swooped through the open window and alighted on the desk with a soft, echoing thump. Chapter 2. The Vice Principal's Visit. Sherlock Holmes possessed an uncanny eye for detail and a memory to match. So when the same snowy owl from 3 nights ago settled on the windowsill, Sherlock recognized her at once. Silently she glided into the room, circled twice, and dropped a single letter into his outstretched hand before vanishing into the darkness. John and Mary Holmes sprang to their feet. John swore under his breath. "Blast it all! An owl delivering the mail? This must be an illusion." Mary, wide-eyed and clutching her rosary, made the sign of the cross. "Good heavens, John, surely it's a messenger from on high." John shook his head. "Now, darling, you're acting like a frightened turkey. If God's messengers ever showed up, I'd wager they'd pick a more dramatic moment than post-time." Mary shot him a fierce look. "How dare you? That's a dreadful thing to say, like Aunt Susan's awful apple pie. Keep it up, and I'll make you eat a slice as penance." Seeing defeat in her glare, John held up his hands and sank back into his chair. Sherlock, meanwhile, had reached for his letter opener. With a quiet scrape, he broke the wax seal and unfolded the parchment. The elegant crest at the top left no doubt as to its origin. This summons came from Vice Principal Tannen of Baker Street Academy. Mr. Holmes handed the parchment to his son. "Sherlock, do you really think this is some kind of divine messenger?" Sherlock gave a half-smile and shrugged. "Hardly. Just an owl trained to deliver mail." He broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The reply inside was deceptively simple. "I will visit before 9 o'clock. Minerva McGonagall." A soft chuckle escaped him. "Well, whoever's behind this certainly believes in their own theatrics." He glanced up at the clock on the mantel. 8:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the mysterious Professor McGonagall was due to arrive. His mother leaned forward, curiosity etched on her face. "Sherlock, what exactly is going on?" He met their puzzled expressions and shook his head, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Let our guest explain." At precisely 9, a polite knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Holmes opened it to reveal a tall woman in a modest tweed skirt and a dark green jacket. Her hair was swept back into a tight bun, and her sharp gray eyes took in the Holmes household with an appraising gaze. "Good evening," she said crisply. "Professor Minerva McGonagall, I received your letter." 5 minutes later, everyone was seated in the drawing room. Professor McGonagall had already formed her first impression of Sherlock. He was taller than most boys his age, his posture impeccable, but his frame so slim it seemed almost fragile. She inclined her head politely and prepared to reveal just why she had made the journey to this unassuming London home. Sherlock wasn't what most people would call a cute little boy. His features were sharp, his face defined by clean lines and angles. Above all, it was his eyes, long, gray, and unnervingly perceptive, that drew attention. His slender, aquiline nose only added to the air of resolve and alertness he carried. To Professor McGonagall, whose standards for a good student were nothing short of exacting, Sherlock's appearance already spoke volumes. After exchanging brief pleasantries in her office, McGonagall leaned forward, folding her hands across her desk. There was no need for small talk. She had a job to do. "Sherlock Holmes," she began, her voice both warm and firm, "you have a gift. Here in Britain, any child born with magical ability is automatically enrolled on Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry's admissions list. On your 11th birthday, you receive an acceptance letter, delivered by owl, and a supply list: robes, books, cauldrons, and, of course, a wand." She paused, letting the news settle in. Sherlock's gray eyes showed neither surprise nor disbelief, only calm interest. "If, for some reason, you miss the first delivery," she continued, "the owl will try again and again until the letter reaches you. For wizards, and witches raised in magical families, this process is as ordinary as breakfast. But many Muggle-born children don't even realize they possess magic or that a hidden world awaits them." Sherlock nodded thoughtfully. The promise of a new life, one where his keen mind and unusual gifts could truly belong, shone in those steady gray eyes. And for Professor McGonagall, that spark of potential was all the reassurance she needed. Professor McGonagall paused, pen poised over her parchment. In ordinary cases, when a newly discovered magical child is born to non-wizarding parents, Hogwarts sends a member of its staff to meet the family in person, ensuring they fully understand and accept the offer of enrollment. "Mr. Holmes, however, is the first to ask us to come," she wrote, her brow lifting in genuine admiration. She thought back to the long, troubled history of magic. In medieval times, fear of the unknown drove whole villages into witch hunts. Wizards and witches, especially the latter, were hunted, tortured, even killed. There was no formal instruction. Every magical child learned at home, their education passed down parent to child, isolated and inconsistent. It was precisely to end that perilous era that Hogwarts Castle opened its doors over 1,000 years ago, promising safety, community, and a thorough magical education. To McGonagall, nothing was more tragic than latent talent left undeveloped. Year after year, she'd met Muggle families who recoiled at the idea of magic and refused the letter of acceptance. And yet here was Sherlock Holmes, born entirely outside the wizarding world, riding to Hogwarts, eager to learn, determined to understand what others feared. She smiled. If ever a student deserved every opportunity Hogwarts could offer, this was the one. Chapter 7. The Weight of Prejudice. Even in 1991, an age when magic in film and television borrows freely from real arcane lore, irrational fear still clings to people's hearts. Why, when the evidence is all around them, do they refuse to accept the truth about wizards and witches? Professor McGonagall, herself nearly 60, understood the answer only too well. Prejudice is an unyielding mountain, no matter how many gusts of reason you throw at it. At Hogwarts, every teacher stresses the same fact. A witch's or wizard's power grows stronger with age. If a young magic user reaches the proper enrollment age without learning control, their latent power can erupt unpredictably, sometimes with disastrous, even fatal results. Yet despite this vital knowledge, some Muggle families cling stubbornly to the notion that wizard equals evil. Time and again, they refuse to send their children to the school of witchcraft and wizardry, convinced they're protecting them. After several dangerous incidents and much heartbreak, Hogwarts instituted a new policy. Once a family has been fully briefed on the realities of the magical world, if they still refuse to enroll their child, that child may remain at home and continue in a Muggle school. It is, professors agree, a last resort, a way to avoid legal entanglements and let fate take its course when all persuasion fails. Hogwarts does not endorse it lightly. In Sherlock Holmes's case, however, there seems little to fear. His keen mind and eager curiosity have already won over even the most skeptical staff. By the time he receives his letter of acceptance, there's every confidence he will walk through Hogwarts's doors and into the future of magic without looking back. Professor McGonagall watched Sherlock just as intently as he watched her. In fact, before she'd finished explaining Hogwarts to him and his parents, Sherlock had already dissected every nuance of her demeanor and reached a startling conclusion. Minerva McGonagall was telling the truth. True, many people claimed you could read a person's innermost thoughts from a flicker of expression, a muscle's twitch, or the slightest eye movement, but only a trained observer could do it effortlessly. Sherlock was such a person. By the time McGonagall had barely settled into her seat before she'd even begun to speak, he'd noted her flawless dark green robes, the neat coil of her curly black hair, the way her square glasses caught the light. Meticulous, disciplined, unwavering. Someone so composed would be far harder to deceive, and equally hard to hide a lie. That revelation made Sherlock pause. Had he misjudged her from the start? Professor McGonagall's words echoed in Sherlock's mind. If she hadn't lied, then this couldn't have been the other man's doing. Magic really exists? He found himself thinking of his favorite maxim, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. He murmured it under his breath. "Excuse me, Mr. Holmes, what did you just say?" McGonagall asked, frowning slightly. Sherlock's parents glanced at him in surprise. "Nothing," he replied, shaking his head. He straightened, fixing the professor with an intense stare. "Actually, Professor, there's a simple way to settle this. Could you show us some magic?" Mr. and Mrs. Holmes leaned forward, their curiosity clearly piqued. McGonagall's lips curved in a faint, amused smile. Certainly. She seemed almost disappointed no one had asked sooner. With a practiced grace, she withdrew her ebony wand and tapped the teacup before Sherlock. In an instant, the delicate china shifted and shimmered, porcelain melting into soft gray fur. Where the teacup had sat now trembled a tiny squirrel, its bright eyes darting between them. Sherlock's father staggered back, exclaiming, "Good heavens!" Mrs. Holmes clutched her hand to her mouth. Sherlock, for once, allowed himself a satisfied smile. Magic, it seemed, was very real indeed. "Look, what is that?" Mrs. Holmes cried, her eyes widening in astonishment. "It's unbelievable. A teacup turned into a squirrel." Sherlock's parents rushed forward, voices thick with excitement, but he remained eerily composed. He crouched beside the little creature and studied it intently. Magic? Hypnosis? An illusion, perhaps. Even now, Sherlock sought a scientific explanation for the impossible scene before him. The squirrel gave a triumphant shake of its fluffy head, then leaped into Sherlock's outstretched hand. It pressed against his palm, its fur warm and soft beneath his fingers. He stroked its back once, twice, so real. No trick of the light, no dream. Sherlock's gaze flicked upward to Professor McGonagall. "Professor," he asked, voice measured, "can you change it back?" "Of course," she replied serenely. With a swift flick of her wand, the squirrel vanished in a sparkle of emerald light. In its place lay the delicate porcelain teacup, still brimming with warm tea. Sherlock stood and recited under his breath, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." This time, he added with quiet conviction, the world contained real magic after all. Sherlock Holmes stood rooted to the spot, struggling to grasp what he'd just witnessed. The kind of fantasy that ought to belong exclusively to storybooks had proved alarmingly real. His entire worldview shuddered, then reassembled itself around an astounding new premise. Magic existed. And once that truth sank in, everything made sense. The exquisitely engraved envelope, the owl that had delivered it, the odd, almost ritualistic manner of his acceptance. He had completely misjudged his correspondent. "Mr. Holmes," Professor McGonagall asked gently, "are you prepared to enroll at our school?" McGonagall had grown used to the looks of astonishment on the faces of children and parents alike when she first demonstrated magic. What really mattered now was whether Sherlock would actually attend. He had already replied to her letter, so the only remaining hurdle lay with his parents. Mr. Holmes met the professor's steady gaze. After a thoughtful pause, he cleared his throat. "Professor, is boarding compulsory for enrollment?" Sherlock seized the opportunity to speak up. "Father, do you really expect me to attend school 100 kilometers away in Scotland and still commute every day?" "Scotland?" Mr. Holmes's face paled. "That's far too distant. How could your mother and I possibly look after you from so far away?" Sherlock raised his chin. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." Mrs. Holmes took a step forward, concern written across her features. "But, please," Sherlock interrupted firmly, "let's hear what Professor McGonagall has to say." "Just a moment." Sherlock held up a hand, cutting through the rising chatter in the room. The Holmes family and Professor McGonagall turned to him, eyebrows raised in unison. McGonagall's eyes were wide with disbelief as she fixed her gaze on Sherlock. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "did you just mention Scotland?" Sherlock met her stare coolly. "Yes, Professor." A flicker of astonishment crossed McGonagall's face. "How did you?" Her question trailed off as she struggled to conceal her surprise. Chapter 3. Science and Magic. Most of the world's magical schools perch high in the mountains, and Hogwarts is no exception. Yet its exact location remains one of the British wizarding world's most closely guarded secrets. Thanks to powerful muggle-repelling charms, anyone without magic sees only crumbling ruins or danger keep out signs. Finding the school by accident is virtually impossible. Just 5 minutes ago, the Holmes family didn't even know magic existed. Then young Sherlock Holmes, a completely ordinary boy from a muggle household, made an astonishing remark, as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. "Hogwarts is in Scotland." Professor McGonagall felt as though she'd been struck by a rampaging gorgon. She forced herself to remain calm. "Excuse me?" she said, voice tight. Sherlock looked entirely unfazed, blinking as though he genuinely wondered why she was so upset. "What you just said means Hogwarts is in Scotland, doesn't it?" McGonagall pressed her lips together, trying to figure out how a muggle child could have deduced the location of Britain's most secretive school. No, you can't possibly know that." He shook his head, offering her a small, rueful smile. "It's a perfectly logical conclusion." When McGonagall still stared at him in bewilderment, Sherlock sighed and reached into his satchel. From its depths he produced a heavy, cream-colored envelope, wax-sealed and edged in green. "I got this 3 days ago," he said, and with that simple act, holding up his Hogwarts acceptance letter, he showed her just how much more extraordinary this muggle boy really was. "This parchment is remarkably thick and sturdy, of such high quality that a single ream costs nearly £half, Sherlock remarked, handing the embossed letter across his desk. Professor McGonagall raised an eyebrow, clearly wondering what point he was making. Sherlock merely nodded toward the window. "Hold it up to the light and take a closer look." Puzzled, she did as he asked. Against the daylight, a faint watermark revealed itself, a large ornate A intricately woven together with the letters LBA. McGonagall's heart skipped a beat. In all her years at Hogwarts, she had overseen thousands of admissions letters, yet she had never noticed anything like this. "Do you know what it signifies?" she whispered. Sherlock's expression remained impassive. "Alba is the Gaelic name for Scotland," he explained. "This paper was produced there." "But," Professor McGonagall began, but Sherlock cut her off, his words tumbling out in a single breath. "On its own, none of these facts proves anything, but combine the Scottish eagle owl that delivered your letter, the tartan plaid of your shirt, clearly a Highland design, and the Scottish Gaelic you just slipped into, and it's simply undeniable. Anyone who can't deduce you're on Scottish soil, and more specifically the hidden grounds of Hogwarts, must be out of their mind." "Merlin's beard," McGonagall whispered, utterly astonished. What had seemed impossible seconds ago now lay plain before her. This young wizard's powers of deduction were nothing short of extraordinary. Once she returned to the castle, she resolved she would advise Headmaster Dumbledore to bolster the school's security. If Sherlock could pinpoint Hogwarts without a single spell, where did that leave them? With her mind still reeling, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts and head of Gryffindor, took her leave. Her admiration for Sherlock Holmes had never been stronger, even if he himself insisted that what he'd done was merely elementary. Professor McGonagall, who was normally strict to a fault, surprised Sherlock by offering him heartfelt praise and sharing lofty hopes for his time at Hogwarts. She was determined to see him well prepared, so she patiently walked him through everything he would need for his new life in the magical world. "Wands, robes, spellbooks, these aren't only found in your imagination," she told him with a small smile. "They're all available right here in London, if you know where to look." She went on to describe Diagon Alley in vivid detail. The crooked, lantern-lit entrance hidden behind a brick wall in the leaky cauldron, the stalls piled high with cauldrons and potion ingredients, the glittering displays of the wand makers at Ollivander's. She even jotted down addresses and names of trustworthy shopkeepers. Under normal circumstances, she might have escorted Sherlock herself, but as both head of Gryffindor House and deputy headmistress, her schedule was already overflowing, especially now, in the frantic weeks before term began. Once she learned that Sherlock's parents not only understood the importance of his magical education, but were also eager to guide him through the preparations, she happily relinquished the task. "You'll be in good hands," she assured him. Before they parted, McGonagall carefully explained the travel arrangements for the start of term. She outlined the protocol for traveling to Hogwarts by car, how to make sure the vehicle could pass through the magical barrier at the station, which route to follow, and what time to arrive at King's Cross. Finally, she presented Sherlock's parents with a formal non-disclosure agreement on behalf of Hogwarts. They were forbidden to reveal the existence of the wizarding world to anyone outside their immediate family. With everything settled, Professor McGonagall gave Sherlock one last, encouraging nod. "I look forward to seeing you in September. Good luck, Mr. Holmes." And with that, Sherlock set off, clutching his neatly folded list of supplies and feeling, at last, ready for the adventure that awaited him at Hogwarts. For the Holmes family, modesty had never been an issue. They preferred quiet lives to flashy displays. Sherlock, however, was visibly thoughtful as Professor McGonagall took her leave, his gaze lingering on the doorway. Mrs. Holmes, Velita, already prone to melancholy, wavered once more. McGonagall had explained that upon acceptance, Sherlock would live at Hogwarts full-time, returning home only for the Christmas and summer breaks. That prospect alone unsettled Velita. The thought of her son spending just over 2 months with her each year for all 7 years of his schooling was almost too much to bear. "My dear Velita," said Mr. Holmes, tannin softly, reaching for his wife's hand. "It's Sherlock's decision. We've always supported him, haven't we?" Velita looked up, concern etched into her features. "I understand, but Tannin, he's only 11. "Trust me," he replied, squeezing her hand gently, "and trust Sherlock. He'll manage just fine." Despite the wizarding world's dubious reputation, Sherlock's safety was their foremost priority. Uncontrolled magic could have dreadful consequences, something neither of them ever wanted to face. Ultimately, this was an opportunity Sherlock had chosen himself. After all, he was no ordinary boy. Mr. Holmes slipped his arm around his wife's shoulders as they strolled toward the bedroom, casting a reassuring glance back at Sherlock. The boy smiled. His father's quiet confidence was all the reassurance he needed. Though Mr. Holmes usually defers to his wife, when the stakes are high, he knows exactly how to make his case. And tonight, he exercised that skill to its fullest. After a long discussion, Mrs. Holmes reluctantly accepted the fact that Sherlock would be spending less time at home over the next 7 years. With that settled, they turned their attention to more practical matters: school preparations. Sherlock had initially planned to buy all his supplies on his own, but Mrs. Holmes refused to let him venture out unaccompanied, and she reminded them both shopping would require the family purse. In the end, father and son agreed to a compromise. They would all go together. The following morning, the trio piled into the carriage and headed for Charing Cross. As they emerged onto the busy streets of Westminster, just a stone's throw from their home in Chelsea, they found themselves in the traditional heart of London. Coaches rattled over granite paving, street vendors hawked newspapers, appurse, and trinkets, and the famous 0-mile marker for Britain's roads and railways stood quietly at the junction. Together, the Holmes family set off through the bustle, ready to gather everything Sherlock would need for his new chapter at school. The Holmes family's destination that afternoon lay on this very street. According to Professor McGonagall, their first task was to find the famed leaky cauldron, though famed, as she admitted, was a standing in the magical world. Until McGonagall mentioned it, neither Sherlock nor his parents had ever so much as heard of the place. Sherlock had assumed it would be an easy errand, but in moments they ran headlong into a problem. "Tanner, have we gone wrong?" Mrs. Holmes asked, glancing left at the large bookstore, then right at the bustling record shop. Both storefronts were well known to Londoners, but neither looked the slightest bit like a pub. Mr. Holmes frowned in agreement. He watched the passers-by. Some streamed into the bookstore, others into the record shop, but not a single person appeared to be slipping into a bar. They exchanged a puzzled look before turning to their son. Unlike them, Sherlock didn't seem confused at all. "There," he murmured, nodding between the two shops. "It's exactly here, between the bookstore and the record store." Mrs. Holmes peered again, then frowned. "I'm not seeing a pub." Sherlock allowed himself the faintest smile. "That's because it's concealed from Muggle eyes. Once you know what to look for, you'll notice the bricked-up archway tucked beside the bookstore's side entrance. There's your leaky cauldron." Sure enough, when Mrs. Holmes squared her shoulders and inspected the narrow strip of wall more closely, she spotted an odd, soot-stained archway blocked by bricks, and a single brass knob, half hidden by shadow. Mr. Holmes reached out and touched the bricks. "Remarkable," he said quietly, just as McGonagall described. Together, the three of them stepped forward. Mrs. Holmes turned the knob, and with a grating creak, the hidden door swung open. Beyond lay a low ceiling, flickering lanterns, and the promise of a very different London than the one they had just left behind. If Professor McGonagall hadn't drawn his attention to it, even Sherlock's legendary powers of observation might not have spotted the leaky cauldron. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes, stood even less of a chance. The hurried expressions of passers-by said it all. No one else noticed the pub. Was this the magical world's trick, muting its presence so that ordinary eyes would slide right by? Sherlock pondered the question but didn't slow his pace. Confidently, he stepped toward the narrow gap between two shop fronts, and his parents, curious, hastened to follow. At first glance, the leaky cauldron looked forlorn, small, dingy, its sign weather-beaten and flaking. Inside, the tavern was dimly lit and sparsely furnished. A handful of dark corners sheltered round wooden tables, where a group of patrons drank and talked boisterously. To anyone unfamiliar with magic, it might have passed for just another shabby neighborhood pub. The guests were dressed in the most outlandish costumes, and their conversations bordered on the absurd. Sherlock caught only a few snippets before turning to his wife and murmuring, "Velita, I'll bet any ordinary person who wandered in here wouldn't even finish their mead before making a quick exit. Mrs. Holmes gave a knowing nod. After all, the very idea of creating a meteor shower sounded downright preposterous. Meanwhile, Sherlock's keen eyes swept over the room, cataloging every eccentric detail and bizarre exchange with effortless precision. Sherlock pushed open the heavy, weathered door of the leaky cauldron and slipped inside, immediately cataloging the patrons by sight alone. Beside him, his two companions, one a muggle friend, the other a young wizard, fell in step. 5 meters to the northwest, Sherlock murmured. A woman in her mid-40s, chain-smoking. Recently separated, obviously here looking for younger company, herself Kay, on Troll's shot. 7 meters dead ahead, he continued, a cheerful bachelor in his early 20s, engaged but determined to savor one last all-male evening. His mates aren't exactly encouraging him. Diagonal table behind us, he nodded toward a short, irritable fellow of about 35. Purse is empty, and he's already plotting an exit strategy to dodge the check. And that broad-shouldered man passing by? Sherlock's eyes followed a stout, ordinary-looking fellow strolling through the low lamplight. No obvious agenda, just a drifter, content to observe. For Sherlock, this rapid appraisal was as natural as breathing. He glanced at his companions, ready to welcome them to the magical underbelly of London, when a new figure detached himself from the shadows. 2 muggles and a young wizard, classic combination, the man called out, easing into the room with friendly confidence. Ah, another summer riding in on the wind. He came to a stop just a pace in front of them. Firelight danced on his neatly trimmed beard, and his eyes held a warm, knowing gleam. "I'm Tom Cruise," he announced, voice low but clear. "But around here, folks call me Old Tom. Welcome to the Leaky Cauldron." Sherlock arched an eyebrow at his companions. "Tom Cruise?" he echoed as the bar's lanterns flickered overhead. Mr. and Mrs. Holmes exchanged uneasy glances as they stepped into the dimly lit tavern. The moment they laid eyes on the proprietor, his scalp largely bare, his leathery face creased like a shriveled walnut, his eyes nearly slits, their lips twitched in spite of themselves. They knew it was rude to stare, but they couldn't look away. Sherlock, however, remained unfazed. He walked straight up to the bar, head held high, and offered a polite nod. "Mr. Cruise," he announced, "Professor McGonagall sent us." At the mention of the professor's name, the barkeeper's wary expression melted into a welcoming smile. "Ah, yes, Professor McGonagall," he said, straightening behind the counter. "Wizards from Muggle families are uncommon, but not unheard of. Please, follow me." As Mr. Cruise led them down a narrow hallway behind the tavern, Sherlock fell into step beside him. Casually, as if discussing the weather, he asked about the patrons they'd glimpsed inside. The barkeeper, who knew every regular by sight, story, and secret, answered with ease. One by one, he confirmed each detail Sherlock had deduced. The traveler in the corner was hunting a rare herb. The hooded woman at the table had fled her homeland last year. The twins near the hearth ran a small apothecary. A faint smile curved Sherlock's lips. Even in a world rich with enchantment, his scientific methods of observation and inference held true. His deductions were accurate, his reasoning unshaken. And so, where logic meets lore and science collides with sorcery, their true adventure was about to begin. Chapter 4. Welcome to Diagon Alley. The gift of discerning hidden truths from the smallest of details, a knack for seeing essence through phenomenon, is rare, but like any talent, it must be sharpened by steady practice. When Sherlock first set out to hone his observational skills, he began with simple exercises. Confronted by a stranger, he would note their clothing, posture, even the calluses on their hands, and from those clues infer their background and occupation. To an outsider, such drills might have appeared childish or dull, yet each one honed his awareness. Over time, and after countless repetitions, Sherlock no longer had to force himself to scrutinize every minutiae. It had become second nature. He instinctively knew where to look and what to look for. Though his method remained a work in progress, he could already ride a train, scan his fellow passengers, and announce each person's profession before the journey was half over. If anyone had dared bet on his accuracy, he would have made a small fortune. Now, as Sherlock peppered Tom the bartender with questions, Tom led him and his parents through the snug, dimly lit bar and into a small, ivy-clad courtyard bordered by high brick walls. The world outside the pub's ordinary facade fell away, replaced by a hush of anticipation, and somewhere beyond this quiet-walled space lay the hidden gateway to Diagon Alley. Sherlock's eyes swept the narrow alley, resting only on a battered trash can shoved against a crumbling brick wall and a few stubborn weeds sprouting from the cracks. So the trick must lie with that trash can. He took 2 deliberate steps forward, and at the same moment, Tom slipped his wand from its holder. Just as Tom raised his wand, he paused, turned back to Sherlock, and grinned. "Once you have a wand, you'll need to come in yourselves. Remember which brick it is, above the trash can." Sherlock inclined his head. "Third one up, second one across." Tom stared at him, incredulous. "How did you know?" Sherlock gestured toward the wall. "It's the only brick that looks different, just a bit lighter in color, its edges more worn. Anyone with keen eyes would spot it." Tom shook his head in genuine admiration. "Your powers of observation never cease to amaze." He raised his wand and tapped that brick 3 times in quick succession. Sherlock and his family crowded closer, their breaths held. With each tap, the brick trembled, and then, as if yielding to an unseen force, a small hole appeared at its center. The bricks in the wall on either side rattled, sliding apart until a wide archway yawned open before them. Beyond it lay a winding, seemingly endless cobblestone street, bright and bustling in stark contrast to the cramped, dim interior of the leaky cauldron. It felt as though an entirely new world had been unveiled. "Welcome to Diagon Alley," called Tom Marsh, the bar's short, rotund proprietor, just as Sherlock and his parents stepped onto the thoroughfare. Sherlock glanced back to see the archway contracting, the bricks snapping into place. Tom gave them a small wave before the portal sealed shut. His father leaned in, murmuring, "He hasn't got enough galleons on him. He's probably looking for the nearest exit." Sherlock hesitated, then couldn't resist a parting shot. "Tom," he called over his shoulder, "you left your payment on the counter." Tom's eyes widened, and he broke into a relieved grin. "Blasted me memory," he mumbled, then darted back through the closed door without even pausing for thanks. From inside the leaky cauldron came muffled shouts of, "Stop him! Catch him!" Sherlock merely shrugged and turned to follow his parents into the bright, winding alley that lay before them. Diagon Alley was a world apart from the dim, cramped corridors of the leaky cauldron. Here, broad cobbled streets gleamed in the afternoon light, shop windows blazed with color, and a throng of witches and wizards bustled from one storefront to the next. Even Mr. Holmes, no stranger to exotic locales, couldn't help but exclaim, "I never imagined London concealed anything like this." Mrs. Holmes slipped her arm through her husband's and gave a soft laugh of agreement. Sherlock, however, lingered at the edge of the crowd, lost in thought. Since confirming that magic really existed, the hidden world's mysteries had only deepened his fascination. The relationship between Diagon Alley and the Muggle world struck him as eerily similar to the dual realities of science fiction's mirror universes. Yet, he found it hard to believe London's municipal authorities were entirely oblivious to a thriving economy they couldn't tax. Surely the Prime Minister or even the royal family must know of this secret. "First things first," Professor McGonagall reminded them, steering the trio northward. Her pointed look sent them down a side street lined with white stone buildings whose arches gleamed like marble. There, nestled between Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor and a curious shop called Quality Quidditch Supplies, stood the proud, domed entrance to Gringotts Wizarding Bank. Inside, gleaming vault doors and whispered incantations confirmed it beyond doubt. The magical world not only existed, it prospered on its own currency. And before they could begin their true investigation, Holmes and Company would need to exchange every nut, sickle, and galleon required for the journey ahead. Sherlock studied the coins in his palm, 17 sickles to a galleon, 29 nuts to a sickle. To him, these convoluted exchange rates were proof enough that the wizarding world hadn't mastered basic arithmetic. Even if they refused to go decimal, surely their own ratios could at least stay consistent? Muggles once juggled pounds, shillings, and pence, 20 shillings to the pound, 12 pence to the shilling, until 1971's decimal reform simplified everything to 100 new pence per pound. The non-magical world marches on. Why can't magic follow suit? Still, impatience wouldn't change reality. He needed to convert his funds, and there was only one place to do it. Rising above the low-roofed shops of Diagon Alley stood Gringotts Wizarding Bank, a gleaming white tower crowned by massive bronze doors that caught the morning sun. Yet more arresting than its facade was the goblin posted at the entrance. Clad in a scarlet coat with gold trim, he surveyed every arrival with sharp, calculating eyes, an unmistakable reminder that at Gringotts, magic and money were inseparable. Chapter 7. A Meeting with the Goblin. Sherlock paused in the dim, vaulted corridor and narrowed his eyes. Before him stood a diminutive figure, long arms and legs, a dark, leathery face, and a pointed beard that lent him an almost impish aspect. Sherlock recognized him at once. "Goblin," he murmured. The corners of Sherlock's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Another creature of myth, another piece of the puzzle. He stepped forward. "Are you the one who exchanges Muggle money for wizarding currency? We've come to make an exchange." The goblin inclined his head briefly, his cold, precise voice echoing against the stone walls. "Follow me, and do not stray." Sherlock couldn't suppress a wry thought. Such haughtiness in customer service. Surely the magical world's goblin banks could use a crash course in politeness. His parents, however, exchanged anxious glances. Mrs. Holmes laid a hand gently on Sherlock's arm. "Tanan, did we bring enough? Sherlock's bound to need more than a few galleons, and I'd hate for him to be short." Mr. Holmes gave her a reassuring squeeze. "My dear Velita, rest easy. Our family's fortune has weathered far worse than fluctuating currency rates." He ruffled Sherlock's hair. "You'll see. We're well prepared." They followed the goblin down a narrow staircase that spiraled into the bowels of the bank. Torches cast dancing shadows on the damp stone, and the air grew cooler with every step. At the bottom, they emerged into a massive chamber ringed with counters, each staffed by a goblin in spotless, dark robes. Piles of shining coins, bronze nuts, silver sickles, and gold galleons were meticulously sorted into crystal bowls. £50 sterling, please," Mrs. Holmes said, lifting her parasol in deference to the nearest teller. The goblin eyed the paper money coolly, then tapped a ledger with claw-like precision. 167 galleons, 4 sickles, 25 nuts. He passed her a parchment receipt. While his mother signed the document, Sherlock surveyed the scene. The other goblins worked with mechanical efficiency, exchanging currencies, tallying sums, and never once lifting their gaze. No idle conversation, no smile for a nervous first-time exchanger, nothing but business. "Thank you," Mr. Holmes said when his turn came. "Should the value of sterling—" "It remains fixed under treaty," the goblin interrupted crisply. "No speculation." He stamped their receipt and slipped it back. "Proceed to Vault 12 if you require storage." Mr. Holmes nodded and led his family toward a side corridor, winding deeper into the labyrinth. Each door bore a number in elegant script. At Vault 12, the goblin produced a heavy key and ushered them inside. Rows of gleaming iron chests stretched into darkness. "Everything looks secure," Mrs. Holmes whispered. "I've never been inside one of these vaults." Sherlock knelt to examine the locks. "Ingenious mechanism," he observed. "Combines both tumbler pins and a magical ward. I'd wager it would take a practical magician and a nimble locksmith no fewer than 10 minutes to breach." Mrs. Holmes shivered. "I'm glad we don't have to test that hypothesis." With the business concluded, the goblin shepherded them back to the surface. Light from lanterns revealed a vaulted ceiling and the bustling throng of wizards and witches hurrying about their affairs. Sherlock inhaled deeply, a spark of excitement in his eyes. Whatever mysteries this world held, he was certain there were more legends yet to meet and more puzzles to unravel. As they stepped into the bright afternoon, Mr. Holmes offered his son a warm smile. "Ready for the next stop, Sherlock?" Sherlock straightened his coat. "After that performance by the goblins, I can hardly wait." Together, they strode forward, eager for the next adventure. Sherlock Holmes felt entirely at ease, secure in his family's vast wealth. As he followed the goblin through the second silver door, the cryptic inscriptions carved into both panels immediately caught his eye. Chapter 5. Bye 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 5. Bye bye bye. "Enter, stranger, but be warned of what awaits the sin of greed. For those who take but do not earn must pay most dearly for their deed. So if you seek beneath our floors a treasure that was never yours, thief, you have been warned. Beware of finding not treasure but retribution." Sherlock tore his eyes away from the warding inscription. A wizarding bank like this had to be supremely confident in its defenses. Every bank bristles with that certainty until calamity strikes. He let his gaze drift across the vaulted marble hall, polished pillars rising into shadow, runic sigils faintly pulsing on the walls. In moments, he'd already identified half a dozen potential weak points. No sorcery required. Just a long night and the right finesse, and this place would be front-page news. Shocking! Bank vaults empty. You-know-who evades every security measure. It wouldn't be the first time. A year ago in London, millions in bearer bonds disappeared from the Bank of England. The official response unfolded in 3 predictable phases. First, flatly deny any breach. Then, admit something might have happened, but urge calm. Finally, concede action may be necessary, yet claim helplessness. And just like that, the scandal vanished from headlines. Sherlock traced a fingertip over one of the glowing runes. Would this institution fare any better? He allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Tonight, he'd find out. Phase 4, if you could even call it that, was already behind them. In hindsight, they might have acted sooner, but now there was no turning back. Wizarding banks really could teach their Muggle counterparts a thing or two about efficiency. Sherlock, still reeling from the revelation that magic was real, resolved to proceed with the utmost caution until he'd fully grasped this astonishing new world. They stepped up to the counter, where their guide, a squat, grinning goblin, handed them off to a pale, well-dressed colleague. This clerk would handle the currency exchange for the 3 of them. Today's rate was astounding. 1 galleon for £5 sterling. In 1991, the pound was at the height of its strength, yet here it was worth only a fifth of a wizarding coin. Mrs. Holmes, who'd been bracing for a financial meltdown, allowed herself a discreet smile. They'd brought enough Muggle money to purchase nearly 1,000 galleons. Just as the clerk began tallying their pile of banknotes, he paused and tapped his ledger. "I'm sorry," he said in that clipped, hollow goblin tone, "but there's a limit on how many pounds we can convert per person each day." Sherlock froze. Then, surprisingly, he exhaled a slow breath of relief. With any luck, this bureaucratic snag would buy him just enough time to learn how magic really worked, before they pressed any further into the unknown. In the non-magical world, ordinary citizens face strict annual limits on how much domestic currency they can convert into foreign money. These controls exist primarily to curb excessive capital movements, especially sudden surges of short-term funds that can wreak havoc on financial markets. In periods of economic downturn or heightened volatility, unchecked currency trading can trigger massive capital flight, setting off a chain reaction of currency devaluation, market chaos, and in the worst cases, a full-blown financial crisis. To protect foreign exchange reserves, shield the domestic economy, and preserve market stability, governments impose a yearly cap on how much foreign currency an individual may purchase. Once you reach that limit, you can't buy any more foreign money until the next calendar year. Given that the magical world runs on its own independent currency system, it's hardly surprising they've adopted similar rules for converting Muggle money into magic coins. But that doesn't make it any less infuriating, especially when only non-magicals are bound by the cap. If everyone had to play by the same exchange rate rules, fine. But as it stands, the restriction feels utterly unfair. Sherlock learned from the goblin banker that wizards born to non-magical families could exchange no more than 128 galleons per year. The goblin didn't specify the limit for pure-blood wizarding households, but Sherlock had long since observed that it was far higher, perhaps even unlimited. It was the same old discrimination, he thought wryly. Still, Sherlock's keen eye on the Gringotts forms revealed something the goblin hadn't mentioned. The 128 galleon cap applied only to currency exchanges using pound sterling. Gringotts was happy to buy gold, jewelry, antiques, and other valuables without imposing that same strict limit. A grin spread across Sherlock's face. He'd stumbled onto a whole new avenue for London's criminal element to launder money. Get hold of gold or jewelry, ship it to Gringotts, and turn it into galleons in any quantity. Gringotts, it turned out, was the perfect, if unwitting, money laundering operation. All a criminal needed was safe passage to Diagon Alley. The goblin being questioned grew visibly impatient, But under Sherlock's relentless probing, he finally relented and revealed a crucial detail. 128 galleons would cover every single item a first-year witch or wizard needs. Beyond that initial outlay, attending Hogwarts, including tuition, meals, and lodging, is entirely free, just as elementary and secondary schooling is in the non-magical world. In Britain, children aged 5 to 17 receive compulsory, state-funded education. The government pays for tuition, textbooks, and all essential supplies. At age 11, they graduate from primary to secondary school, so aside from that annual back-to-school shopping trip, no further fees are required. By the time Sherlock and his parents finally stepped out of Gringotts, they had exchanged £640 for as many galleons as the bank would allow. Mrs. Holmes, however, still wore a troubled expression. She couldn't shake the old adage, poor at home, rich abroad, and found herself wondering whether they ought to return home first, take more gold and convert it into galleons, just to make sure Sherlock wouldn't run out of funds so far from London. Sherlock cut her off gently. "Let's finish our shopping first," he said. "If we really do run short, then we'll think about converting more money." Mrs. Holmes conceded, and they set off through Diagon Alley toward the school supply shops. Sherlock's first stop was Flourish and Blott's, where he bought every textbook on the Hogwarts list. Then he moved on to Madame Malkin's for 3 sets of plain work robes, which came to 20 galleons. At the apothecary, he grabbed a brass cauldron, weighing scales, and vials for potions, and at the astronomy shop, a good quality telescope for 10 galleons. Finally, he picked up a sturdy quill and some parchment for 1 galleon. Standing among his purchases, Sherlock realized the goblin's boast had been half true. 128 galleons was indeed just enough to cover everything on the school list, but it was hardly more than enough. As he surveyed the pile of books, robes, and magical apparatus, he nodded to himself. They'd made it, just barely. Sherlock nearly choked when he discovered that a single brand-new textbook cost 9 galleons. Were magical tomes really that outrageously priced? The staggering total only soured Mrs. Holmes's mood further, and she promptly rejected his suggestion to buy used copies. Sherlock felt a pang of frustration. As a born pragmatist, he saw no practical difference between a new textbook and one that had been previously owned, except that a second-hand edition went for only a third of the price. Such a saving was too good to ignore, yet his mother remained adamant. In the end, Sherlock complied. He purchased all the required texts on his school's reading list, and even splurged on a few supplementary volumes to deepen his knowledge of the wizarding world. Among them were important magical events of the 20th century, the rise and fall of the dark arts, and the best-selling survival handbook by Bear Grylls. Despite the cost, he hoped these extra resources would give him an edge once classes began. Chapter 6. Broomsticks and Wands. Sherlock picked up a slim, well-thumbed volume on the shelf, Survival Handbook in Desperate Situations by Bear Grylls. Its motto, "Better safe than sorry," was emblazoned across the cover, and the contents promised a treasure trove of first-hand advice for surviving the magical world's deadliest hazards. Rampaging trolls, long-tailed crocodiles lurking in swampy waters, stealthy vampires, and the notorious Voldemorts. Intrigued by Grylls' hair-raising anecdotes and practical tips, Sherlock skimmed through the chapters. He closed the book with a decisive nod and headed straight to the counter. Before he left the shop, one final line caught his eye, bolded and underlined at the very end of the essential packing list. First-year students are strictly prohibited from bringing their own broomsticks to Hogwarts. Sherlock raised an eyebrow. Rules existed to be understood, and, when necessary, challenged. He didn't yet know if carrying a broomstick was strictly essential for first years, but he was determined to find out exactly what a broom could do. A short walk north along Diagon Alley brought him to quality Quidditch supplies. Through the shop window, Sherlock saw row upon row of polished shafts and gleaming bristles, each broomstick poised as if ready to take flight. He pushed open the door, the soft jingle of bells announcing his arrival, and stepped into a world he'd only ever glimpsed from textbooks. It was time to learn what these curious, enchanted handles were truly capable of, and whether he could bend the rules to make one his own. As the name implies, broomsticks are simply brooms enchanted to fly, and in the wizarding world, They're the most common means of travel. Naturally curious, Sherlock was immediately captivated by these magical conveyances. But when he began to ask prices, his fascination gave way to disbelief. Basic models started at 1 to 200 galleons, a sum that already maxed out the annual currency exchange allowance for non-magical families. And top-of-the-line brands like the Nimbus 2000 or the Shooting Star fetched well over 1,000 galleons apiece. The shopkeeper explained that aside from personal transport, the greatest draw of broomsticks was competitive sport, specifically Quidditch. Think of it as soccer, but played in midair, with hoops instead of goals, and a handful of extra twists to keep things interesting. It was the wizarding world's favorite pastime, and every student at a magic school dreamed of donning their house colors and taking to the skies. After weighing his options, Sherlock politely declined the pet shop owner's eager offer, even though the man claimed he could secretly smuggle broomsticks into the school for first-year students. Instead, Sherlock once again persuaded his mother to purchase a pewter cauldron. Mrs. Holmes had originally wanted a pure gold model. The Hogwarts enrollment list had been very clear. Broomsticks were forbidden, but new students were allowed one familiar, an owl, a toad, or a cat. The pet shop owner was happy to explain why toads, once the hottest magical pets decades ago, had lost their appeal. Lacking any real magic of their own, toads had nevertheless made excellent test subjects for charms practice and potion trials. Their skin absorbed liquids so readily that potion tasters and apprentice apothecaries found them especially handy. But times changed. Toads fell out of fashion, and cats, while helpful mousers, often provoked sneezing fits and itchy eyes. By process of elimination, owls remained the clear favorite. Sherlock eyed the owl's 15-galleon price tag with mild astonishment. It was far costlier than the 10 galleons he'd paid on average for a cat, or the single digits one usually spent on a toad. Yet he had chosen the owl without hesitation. Its ability to carry letters and parcels made the extra expense more than worthwhile. For once, the three members of the Sherlock family had reached an easy consensus. Their next, and most eagerly anticipated, stop was the very reason they'd come to Diagon Alley in the first place. Ollivander's, the only wand shop on the entire south side of the street. Unlike the neighboring storefronts that bustled with new paint and polished signs, Ollivander's looked uncommonly small and a little threadbare. In the dusty front window, a single wand lay upon a faded purple cushion. Above the door, the gold-lettered sign, peeling at the edges, proclaimed, Ollivander's, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. Sherlock suspected the lack of renovation was no accident, but rather a deliberate nod to the shop's venerable heritage. He pushed open the door. A cluster of tinkling bells announced his entrance. Inside, the room felt snug and almost echoey. There were no display tables or chairs, only a long wooden bench pushed into one corner. Everywhere else, floor-to-ceiling shelves bristled with narrow boxes, each promising its own quiet magic. Sherlock stepped forward, heart thumping with anticipation. Somewhere in this dimly lit haven lay the wand that would choose him. The moment they stepped inside, Sherlock's gaze was drawn to the thousands of slender wooden boxes lining every wall, from floor to ceiling, each bearing a fine layer of dust. A soft, measured voice broke the silence. Welcome. Out of the dimness emerged a small, elderly man, whose silvery eyes shone like twin moons in the gloom. Sherlock's mind ticked off observations. The man was clever and confident, yet there was a touch of loneliness in his posture. His movements were gentle, just the kind of compassion you'd expect from someone who'd spent a lifetime helping others. He looked to be in his mid-50s and had clearly just served another customer. With a warm smile, the old man addressed Sherlock and his parents. What a pleasure! Such a fine young wizard, and from a Muggle family. Sherlock's brow lifted at the word Muggle. He'd heard it once before that morning from Tom at the Leaky Cauldron. From context, it designated folks born without magic. Still, it felt oddly alien on the tip of his tongue. The wand-maker's eyes fixed on Sherlock. Which hand do you use to wield your wand? Right hand, Sherlock replied promptly. Then, as if testing the waters, he added, though I could manage left-handed if necessary. Mr. Ollivander's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. In all his years behind that counter, never had a young witch or wizard displayed such ambidextrous nonchalance. He paused, considering the boy before him, then set a delicate brass measuring tape on the workbench. "Very well," he said, draping the tape from Sherlock's shoulder to his palm. "Let's begin." From his shoulders down to his fingertips, from his wrists up to his elbows, from his knees up to his armpits, every dimension was taken with precise care. Sherlock raised an eyebrow when the tailor's tape measure began to wind itself in and out as if guided by an invisible hand. Then he reminded himself he was in the magical world. If there was no logical explanation, there must be magic filling the gap. Mrs. Holmes, however, was positively delighted. This auto-measuring device was nothing short of miraculous. She made a mental note to ask the tailor where she could procure one. Imagine how much easier dressmaking would become for both her husband and son. Once the measurements were complete, Mr. Ollivander led Sherlock to a long, polished display of wands. Sherlock had assumed this would be a quick formality, yet he would soon realize it took longer than any shopping excursion his mother had ever endured. "Here we go," said Ollivander, handing him a slender wand. 9 inches, willow with a swishy flexibility, excellent for general casting. Give it a wave. Sherlock took the wand, only to have it whisked back the instant he thought to stir his wrist. He glared. "Not quite," Ollivander murmured, sliding another wand into his hand. "Mahogany, 10¼ inches, more supple." Before Sherlock could ask a question, the wand was once again snatched away. This time, he managed to wave it, but nothing happened. No tingling down his spine, no spark of light, no response at all. Sherlock frowned, wand motionless in his hand. He glanced at Mrs. Holmes, who looked on with hopeful anticipation. Ollivander hovered nearby, already reaching for the next option. The search had only just begun. Unicorn hair, ebony core, excellent flexibility, 9¾ inches. A wand clattered to the floor from the shelf behind me. Clearly not the right fit. The wandmaker sighed softly. Ash wood, phoenix feather, 7½ inches. I waited as he lifted yet another slender wand. Black walnut, dragon nerve, 8 inches. One by one, he tested wand after wand, each description punctuating the quiet of the shop. When a wand didn't suit me, it tumbled from his hand or slid from the rack with a soft thud, and so the minutes drifted past, unnoticed and unremarked, until I began to wonder if I'd ever find the one. Chapter 7. Just because I saw you in the crowd. Ollivander's wand shop on Diagon Alley was quiet, but for the soft scrape of shelves and the occasional tinkle of glass. Sherlock Holmes lifted wand after wand, testing each one with a tentative flick, yet none seemed to answer his touch. Mr. Ollivander, far from growing impatient, actually became more animated with every near miss, his pale eyes gleaming as he watched Sherlock's every movement. Sherlock said nothing, simply allowing the proprietor to hand him one wand after another, as if in a carefully choreographed dance. He looked perfectly calm, almost detached. Nearby, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes exchanged worried glances. They had no clue which wand the eccentric old man truly believed would suit their son. Every time Sherlock raised a wand to his lips, Mr. Ollivander would snatch it away before he could even wave it, let alone summon a spark of magic. This had happened 6 times already. At last, Mrs. Holmes leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Tannen, maybe we should try another shop." Her husband hesitated. "But I heard this is the only place renowned for fine wands." Before he could finish, Ollivander snapped his head toward them. His voice was quiet but carried unmistakable authority. "Is this lady questioning the Ollivander family?" Under that keen, unwavering gaze, Mrs. Holmes froze, unsure how to reply. Holmes shifted uneasily on his feet. "No, I really don't want to be a bother." "Bother?" Ollivander smiled kindly. "Our family has been making wands since 382 BC. No customer is too particular. We always find the perfect match." Holmes cocked an eyebrow. "Even the wizard who came in just now and walked out dissatisfied." Ollivander's eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, a very particular client, and quite famous to boot." He chuckled, then paused as if realizing he'd misspoken. "Of course, it's not that the wizard chooses the wand, but the wand chooses its wizard. No one ever leaves Ollivander's disappointed." With that, he strode over to the shelf where wands had earlier flown down and retrieved a simple black stick from a corner. "Here, beechwood with a dragon heartstring core, 12 inches long, sturdy yet springy. Have a feel for it." Holmes took the wand gingerly. The instant his fingers closed around it, A peculiar warmth spread through his palm and up his arm. He felt, quite unmistakably, a thread of connection, as though the wand had been waiting for him all along. He lifted the wand with a careful flick. A single ring of white smoke blossomed and drifted lazily upward, and, faint as a memory, he thought he heard a ship's whistle and the distant laughter of sailors. Even without any magical training, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes sensed that this wand had found its match in their son. "Did this wand choose me?" Sherlock asked softly as Mr. Ollivander placed the polished box in his hands. "Indeed it does," the wand-maker replied with a pleased smile. "The wand chooses the wizard. That's the old saying, and it holds true." He paused, tapping a thin finger against the glass display. "Beech wood, you see. In an adult, a beech wand denotes patience and deep understanding. In someone your age," he looked Sherlock straight in the eye, "it speaks of wisdom beyond your years." Sherlock allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Outside the hushed wonder of the wand's resonance, Mrs. Holmes stepped forward and raised a delicate brass tape measure. "Sir, what about this self-measuring tape? Could I—" Mr. Ollivander's expression softened with regret. "I'm afraid non-wizards cannot activate its charms. It gauges magical signature, after all." Mrs. Holmes's shoulders dipped in disappointment, but Mr. Holmes simply drew 8 galleons from his pouch and laid them on the counter. Once the coins clinked, Ollivander wrapped Sherlock's wand in silken paper and placed it in a neat, ribbon-tied box. With a final nod to the wand-maker, the Holmes family stepped out of the narrow shop and into the bright bustle of Diagon Alley. Sherlock cradled his new wand against his chest, already eager to discover its possibilities. Ollivander bowed as they stepped into the street, murmuring to himself, "2 picky customers in one day. Hogwarts is in for a treat this year." He watched the small family vanish into the crowd. At last, Sherlock and his parents wrapped up their Diagon Alley errands. By sticking strictly to the school supply list, they'd spent nearly 80 galleons, and with a few extra books on Sherlock's pile, he had under 20 galleons left to his name. Mrs. Holmes couldn't help but grumble about the ministry's refusal to exchange wizarding currency for Muggle families, feeling it amounted to outright discrimination. But after Mr. Holmes gently persuaded her to let it go, they made their way back to the leaky cauldron without further fuss. Just as their carriage was about to pull away, Sherlock halted. Across the way, a man and a woman hovered between Flourish and Blots and the record shop, a small girl tagging along beside them. Something about their uneasy pacing caught his eye, and Sherlock's curiosity was instantly piqued. Sherlock caught sight of a neatly dressed couple and their little daughter wandering aimlessly between the bookstore and the record shop. In an instant, he deduced their purpose was exactly the same as his and John's had been. Not long ago, they were looking for the leaky cauldron. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes, noticed his steady stare and followed his gaze. The mother and father stood side by side, attentive but puzzled, as their brown-haired daughter chattered excitedly about wizards and secret pubs. Although they lacked Sherlock's razor-sharp powers of deduction, it was obvious even to them that this family sought the very spot where the magical and the mundane intersected. Mrs. Holmes, ever the warm soul, remembered too well how disorienting it had felt, the endless streets, the hidden doorways, when she and her husband first crossed the threshold of Diagon Alley. Without a second thought, she took her husband's arm and guided him toward the trio, clearly determined to offer her help. Sherlock knew perfectly well that, with a little magic on their side, the family would find the leaky cauldron in due time. He certainly hadn't expected his mother's eagerness to intervene, triggered merely by his glance. Now that his parents were already deep in animated conversation with strangers, he resigned himself to joining them. "Just as I thought," he murmured to himself, falling into step behind them. "Looking for Diagon Alley as well?" the woman asked, offering a friendly smile. Mrs. Holmes, riding the high of her recent successes, returned the grin and jumped into conversation with the confidence of a seasoned traveler. "Don't even get me started on those goblins at the bank," she said. "They're absolute nightmares, worse than Aunt Susan's rock-hard apple pie." The other couple laughed, and Mrs. Holmes pressed on. "And would you believe they let us exchange only 128 galleons? It's ridiculous, practically a joke." If I ever see them again, she continued, tapping her booted foot for emphasis, I swear I'll show them my best kicking technique. Her bold, good-natured chatter melted any awkwardness between the two groups. Introductions followed. The Holmeses and the Grangers, Hermione and her parents, all discovered they were outsiders in this magical world, neither witches nor wizards. Mrs. Holmes's eyes lit up, and she reached for Sherlock's sleeve. Sherlock, this is Miss Hermione Granger. She's also a first year at Hogwarts. You two should stick together. It'll make life much easier. Sherlock offered Hermione a polite nod, and Hermione returned it with an equally courteous smile. In that moment, two new friendships were forged, over goblin grievances, a pinch of humor, and the shared excitement of the adventures awaiting them at Hogwarts. Chapter 8. Two Names. Mrs. Holmes had been more than willing to lend a hand to the Grangers, though, to be honest, helping Hermione was only part of her motivation. As a mother, she knew all too well how her son's peculiarities could make friendship difficult. Sherlock was brilliant, yes, but he was also endlessly curious, deeply private, and awkward in company. At his previous school, she'd tiptoed around his solitary habits until Sherlock himself had stepped in to solve the social problem in his own inimitable fashion and left everyone a little worse for wear. If this year he could simply make a friend before setting foot on Hogwarts grounds, Mrs. Holmes thought it would be a victory in itself. While his mother fussed over schedules and trunks, Sherlock himself had already extended a greeting to the girl they'd come to meet. She stood clutching her own luggage, bushy brown hair tumbling around her shoulders. Hermione Granger. She'd introduced herself, and now Sherlock nodded politely in her direction. Then he turned to her father. Dr. Granger, he said crisply, it's a pleasure to meet you. Mr. Granger froze mid-stride, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. It's a pleasure, but how do you know I'm a doctor? He hadn't given his name with a title. He hadn't mentioned his profession at all. Mrs. Granger and Hermione exchanged startled looks, while Mrs. Holmes and Mr. Holmes shared a quick, knowing smile. Nothing Sherlock said or deduced came out of thin air. Before he could elaborate, though, his mother offered him an encouraging nod. Go ahead, Sherlock, she prompted. Explain yourself. Sherlock glanced at his mother, then faced Mr. Granger again. When you lifted your satchel onto the platform, I noticed its rubber grip handle is identical to those on standard Muggle field doctor kits. A faint scent of isopropyl clung to the leather, and the slight imprint where you store your stethoscope was unmistakable. Lastly, the brass clasp bears a tiny engraved Dr. H. Granger. He paused. That, combined with your calm confidence in a crowded station, told me everything I needed to know. Mr. Granger ran a hand through his hair, chuckling in amazement. Extraordinary. I suppose I should be more careful where I leave my things. He offered Sherlock a wry smile. Very well, Sherlock Holmes, just in case you're wondering my name. Sherlock Holmes, Sherlock repeated evenly. Mrs. Granger looked from father to son, her curiosity piqued. No title, then? None that concerns you, Sherlock replied lightly. But if I ever require medical attention, I do hope you'll call on me, Dr. Granger interjected with a grin. A comfortable silence settled over the group, broken at last by the shrill blast of the Hogwarts Express whistle. Parents and children gathered their final belongings, exchanging hugs and last words of advice. Hermione stepped forward, her face alight with excitement and maybe a little nerves. Sherlock inclined his head. Miss Granger. Hermione's eyes met his. Hermione Jean Granger, she announced, offering a small curtsy. But everyone calls me Hermione. It's very nice to meet you properly, Hermione. He gave her a brief, polite nod. See you on the train. The great scarlet engine ground into motion, and Mrs. Holmes shepherded her son toward their compartment. Through the window the Grangers waved. Already under the glow of platform lamps, two names, Holmes and Granger, stood side by side. By the time the train eased out of the station, neither family could doubt that the coming year would be unlike any other. Mrs. Granger, I believe my mother has pulpitis from untreated cavities, Sherlock said, his tone level and precise. She's afraid of the pain and reluctant to see a dentist. I was hoping you could help her. Mrs. Granger's eyes brightened at once. Of course, tell me exactly what she's been experiencing. Although Mrs. Holmes shot her son a sharp look, she reluctantly began to describe her symptoms to Mrs. Granger. While the two women spoke, Hermione Granger, drawn by the convie, Arsation, glanced at Sherlock. He had short black hair, distinctive gray eyes, and stood noticeably taller than most boys his age. Having just announced both his mother's and father's professions to Mrs. Granger, he seemed even more intriguing. Hermione's gaze lingered on his profile, particularly his long, aquiline nose. So striking, she thought, and felt her cheeks grow warm at her own bold scrutiny. When Sherlock's sharp eyes met hers across the room, Hermione flushed and hurriedly looked away. The Grangers realized they were running late. Mrs. Granger still needed to pick up Hermione's school supplies, but the two mothers chatted amiably for a moment longer. Then, before they parted, Mrs. Granger reached into her purse and handed Mrs. Holmes her business card. "If you decide to come by my practice, just call me," she said with a reassuring smile. "I'll make sure your appointment is as comfortable as possible." With that, the Grangers wished the Holmes family well and slipped out the door, leaving Mrs. Holmes clutching the card and Sherlock watching their departure with keen interest. That afternoon in Diagon Alley ended on a perfectly cheerful note. Sherlock's mother not only led the Grangers straight to the leaky cauldron, but also regaled Mrs. Granger with every last detail of her shopping spree, from bargain robes in Madame Malkin's to curious trinkets at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. In return, Mrs. Granger insisted Mrs. Holmes take advantage of a pain-free comprehensive dental checkup before the Hogwarts term began. The two women parted with promises to stay in touch, and everyone left in good spirits. Over the next month, Sherlock threw himself into preparations for school. He scarcely thought of the Grangers. His mother's relief from pulpitus had been a welcome surprise, but the idea of Hermione or anyone else fussing over him at Hogwarts was out of the question. He'd always found self-care tedious enough, let alone relying on a certain little witch. And besides, if he were tied to a constant babysitter, how would he ever have time to explore the castle? So instead, Sherlock turned his attention to his new companion. He experimented with the snowy owl he'd purchased in Diagon Alley until he was confident it could carry both letters and parcels, just as the pet shop owner had promised. Unlike the regular post, the owl's speed and pinpoint accuracy made it an invaluable messenger. Finally, Sherlock knelt beside the alert white bird, smiled, and said the one name that felt perfectly fitting: Watson. Sherlock couldn't say exactly why, but the name felt right, perfect for a companion he intended to keep for the long haul. By now, he'd read every required textbook and every supplementary volume he could get his hands on. Through them, he'd built a systematic, comprehensive understanding of the wizarding world. While most students were captivated by the prodigious young witch Hermione Granger, Sherlock found two other figures far more intriguing. The first was Harry James Potter. His name appeared in nearly every source. The school's required history of magic, as well as the additional books Sherlock had purchased, important magical events of the 20th century, and the rise and fall of dark arts. Born July 31, 1980, Potter was known by astonishing titles: The Boy Who Lived, The Savior of the Wizarding World, and The Dark Lord's Only Nemesis. Those grand epithets stemmed from yet another famed name closely linked to him: the Dark Lord whom Harry Potter had miraculously restrained. Descriptions in Sherlock's books painted this Dark Lord as the most formidable and dangerous wizard in recorded history, and it was Potter, still a boy, who alone had the power to defy him. Even when his name had to appear in print, most magical books would never call him Lord Voldemort. Instead, they referred to him by fearful euphemisms: he who must not be named, you know who, or simply the Dark Lord. Only a handful of texts dared to spell out his true name, and even then only once before retreating back into euphemism. Sherlock, a man of science and logic, could hardly wrap his mind around it. Such superstition seemed absurd, yet it was precisely the magical world's custom. Voldemort's reign of terror had been the darkest chapter in wizarding history. Empowered by dark magic and a legion of fanatical followers, he nearly conquered the entire magical community. Oppression mounted under his iron fist until discontent finally boiled over, igniting a protracted war of good versus evil. Leading the resistance was Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. His courage and wisdom rallied countless witches and wizards to the cause, and his victory over Voldemort established Hogwarts's and Dumbledore's legendary status throughout the magical world. This conflict, remembered as the First Wizarding War, raged for 11 long years and left the entire magical community reeling from its losses. By all accounts, had it dragged on any longer, Lord Voldemort's iron grip might have crushed the wizarding world entirely. Yet, just as Voldemort reached the zenith of his power, fate intervened with an event no one saw coming. On the night of October 31st, 1981, All Hallows' Eve, the Dark Lord appeared in the tiny village of Godric's Hollow. Nestled in southwest England, Godric's Hollow was named after the great Gryffindor founder and was home to many witches and wizards, though it had the quiet charm of a Muggle hamlet. Among its residents were James and Lily Potter, two exceptionally gifted magic users who had fought bravely on the front lines against Voldemort's rise. Despite their talents and valor, the Potters stood no chance when Voldemort himself arrived at their doorstep. Within moments, James and Lily were cut down. No last-minute rescue, no narrow escape. Having dispatched Harry's parents with ruthless efficiency, Voldemort raised his wand to the Potter's only child, 15-month-old Harry. Even for a wizard who had shattered enchantments, terrorized entire communities, and seemingly mastered death itself, this final step proved fateful. Something happened, whether in ancient magic, a mother's sacrificial love, or pure chance, that deflected the killing curse. In that instant, the Dark Lord's power faltered, and the world changed forever. Harry Potter survived, and with his survival, the darkest chapter of the Wizarding War drew to an unexpected close. A devastating spell, long believed to be unbeatable, reduced the Potters' home to a smoldering ruin. Yet Harry emerged from the wreckage completely unharmed. In that single miraculous moment, he became the first and only person ever to survive an attack by Lord Voldemort. Chapter 9. The Long Platform, the Long Wait, You-Know-Who, Lord Voldemort, the Dark Lord, had vanished, leaving behind nothing more than a baby named Harry Potter and a lightning bolt scar on his forehead. To this day, nobody understands exactly why the killing curse rebounded, destroying Voldemort's body instead of its intended victim. Yet the fact remained indisputable. The most feared wizard of his age was defeated by an infant. With that single miraculous event, 11 years of war came to an end, and the wizarding world was finally free from terror. Before he could even walk or talk, Harry Potter was hailed as the boy who lived. His name spread through every home, and some even campaigned to declare the anniversary of Voldemort's downfall an official holiday, Harry Potter Day. Though the proposal was ultimately shelved, it did nothing to diminish Harry's legendary status. Under the rules of the magical community, Harry, who was exactly the same age as Sherlock Holmes, would begin his first year at Hogwarts in the summer of 1991. Sherlock, having devoured every available account of the boy who lived, found Harry's story infinitely more intriguing than that of Hermione Granger or any other incoming student. Armed with that knowledge, Sherlock came to a decision that would set his own extraordinary year in motion. Term had barely started when Sherlock decided to zero in on Harry Potter as his first and best way to penetrate the wizarding world. If this place really was like a novel, Harry might not be the hero, but he was certainly a key player, someone around whom all the interesting conflicts and secrets seemed destined to swirl. Sticking close to him would open far more doors than trying to ingratiate himself with Headmaster Dumbledore or Professor McGonagall. Of course, there was a catch. Harry's fame in the magical community guaranteed he'd be surrounded by admirers at every turn. Winning his attention wouldn't be easy, but that only made the challenge more enticing. At last, September 1st arrived. That morning, Mr. and Mrs. Holmes escorted Sherlock through the throngs at King's Cross Station, bound for Platform 9 3/4, and the beginning of his extraordinary apprenticeship under the boy who lived. Chapter 7. Platform 9 3/4 Sherlock Holmes had deduced quite correctly that Hogwarts lay hidden in the misty Scottish Highlands, a fact Professor McGonagall later confirmed. Yet when he unwrapped his train ticket and read the boarding instructions, he couldn't help raising an eyebrow. "A train?" he quipped, handing the ticket to his companion. "Going to a wizarding school by rail is somewhat ridiculous. Have they run out of magic carpets?" The ticket was unmistakable. The Hogwarts Express would depart King's Cross Station from platform 9 3/4 at 11 o'clock sharp. Of course, everyone knew King's Cross had only platforms 9 and 10, no fractional platforms in between. Fortunately, Professor McGonagall had prepared them for exactly this conundrum. After patiently guiding Sherlock through the wonders of Diagon Alley, she drew an invisible line between the two plastic placards marking platforms 9 and 10. "You'll find 9 3/4 by walking straight at the barrier," she'd instructed. "Trust your judgment and keep your pace steady." At 10 o'clock, father and son stepped onto the bustling London concourse. On either side, large plastic signs proclaimed 9 and 10, with nothing but solid brickwork blocking the space between. Sherlock regarded the wall with that familiar spark in his eye. He knew better than to look for a door or key. The platform lived in people's belief. The barrier itself was the gateway. As the clock neared 11, a piercing whistle echoed through the station. Sherlock smiled down at his son. Then, without hesitation, he took a decisive stride forward. Bricks shivered under his approach, then parted like curtains, revealing the gleaming scarlet carriages of the Hogwarts Express. The boy let out a laugh of pure wonder. Sherlock paused beside the threshold, adjusting his coat, and waved again and again until his son clambered aboard. With one final nod, Holmes stepped back, turned, and vanished into the London crowd, leaving footprints of proof that, in the world of magic, the impossible was merely the untried. Mrs. Holmes turned away, her shoulders trembling as the moment of parting closed in on her. Sentimental by nature, she could scarcely bear to watch her son step into the unknown. Nearby, Mr. Sep Holmes, ever the steadfast patriarch, gave Sherlock one last wave, then drew his wife into a tight embrace before they both turned and walked down the street. Sherlock waited until their footsteps faded before focusing on the imposing brick wall before him. He approached it slowly, curious. First, he pressed his hand flat against the cool mortar. There was no give, no illusion of solid ground. Then, fingering the bricks, he tapped out a series of methodical raps. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was heavy, dense, undeniable proof that the wall was neither illusory nor hollow. Crouching, he studied the ground at the base of the wall. There, clear as day, were footprints paired with the parallel tracks of a small trolley. They led unbroken through the bricks and emerged on the other side. The stride of those prints suggested a powerful, hurried launch. A slight smile curved Sherlock's lips. Even without Professor McGonagall's cryptic hints, he now understood the enchantment guarding the entrance. Only a determined run, bricks met with purpose, would carry a person through. A casual touch would yield nothing, preventing unsuspecting muggles from accidentally stumbling into Hogwarts. With the mystery solved, Sherlock straightened, placed the trolley at his side, and readied himself for what lay beyond the wall. Face the wall, quicken your pace and charge! Sherlock kept his eyes open, yet for an instant darkness swallowed him whole. Then, as suddenly as it came, the blackness lifted. Before him stretched empty railway tracks and a bustling platform. He turned around. Where a solid brick wall had stood was now a graceful wrought-iron archway crowned with the legend, Platform 9 course. Fascination flickered across Sherlock's face, and for the first time, a genuine smile appeared. He had been convinced the owl post message was nothing more than a prank. He never imagined it would turn out to be the key to an entirely new world. From this moment, this very platform, he knew boredom would be a thing of the past. He'd arrived early, and the scarlet steam engine of the Hogwarts Express hadn't yet made its appearance. Rather than grow restless, Sherlock settled onto the long, echoing platform and set about studying the other witches and wizards milling around him. One by one, he catalogued their mannerisms, backgrounds, and possible secrets. In that way, the time passed swifter than he'd expected. What had promised to be a tedious wait became his first true glimpse into a life brimming with mystery and magic. Sherlock let his gaze wander from the round-faced boy and his grandmother to the next faces in the crowd, ready to pick out his next target. Then a deep crimson steam engine thundered into the station. Above its polished boiler swung a brass placard, Hogwarts Express, 11 a.m. The moment the train came to a halt, travelers surged onto the platform. Thick clouds of steam curled overhead, drifting through the chatter and laughter. Carriage by carriage, students tumbled aboard. Some leaned out to exchange last words with their families. Others clambered over seats in a game of tag, and still more settled quietly in their places, eyes alight with excitement at this new adventure. Amid that joyful tumult, Sherlock remained perfectly still. He didn't yet bother to fish out his ticket or join the boarding line. Instead, he watched, calculating, unhurried, as the Hogwarts Express filled with eager young witches and wizards and the platform buzzed with possibility. He had been standing on the platform for what felt like ages, his gaze never straying far from the hall, tracks. His quarry still hadn't appeared, but he didn't mind the delay. He could wait as long as it took. Steam curled from the locomotive's funnel, drifting through the chilly morning air. Passengers bustled past him in a blur of coats and luggage, oblivious to the quiet man in the shadows. Sherlock's posture remained composed, his eyes alert for the figure he knew would come. Finally, a small, thin boy emerged at the far end of the platform, struggling under the weight of a large leather trunk. His shoulders stooped, he shifted the burden from one foot to the other, glancing around uncertainly. Sherlock's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "At last," he whispered to himself, his pulse quickening. "I've been waiting for you." Chapter 10 First Meeting with Harry Potter. Harry Potter felt utterly lost. Earlier that morning, his normally surly Uncle Vernon had driven him all the way to King's Cross Station and even helped him heave his heavy trunk onto the platform. Harry had wondered at Vernon's sudden kindness until he realized there was no platform 9-4 in sight. No wonder Vernon had vanished so quickly. He'd deserted Harry here, alone. Heart-pounding, Harry glanced around the bustling station. He'd read about Hogwarts' secret departure point, but word for word, he couldn't even explain where to find it. Summoning his courage, he approached a passing guard. "Excuse me," Harry began hesitantly. "I'm looking for—" The guard cut him off with an impatient snort. "If you're not buying a ticket, move along." Harry tried to explain something about a hidden platform, but his words sounded muddled. When the guard demanded to know what time his train was supposed to leave, Harry admitted he didn't know. He'd been dropped off at random. The guard's scowl deepened. "Stop causing trouble," he barked, and walked away. Harry's stomach dropped. The clock on the station wall showed it was nearly 11, and every other platform in sight brimmed with departing steam trains, none of them his. He closed his eyes, breathing in the smell of coal smoke and the roar of departing engines, and felt tears well up. Everything seemed hopeless. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a kindly-looking wizard family nearby. The father was helping his daughter lift a trunk. The mother was fussing over a bundle of feathers in her son's arms. They noticed Harry's crestfallen expression and exchanged a glance. Gently, the father came over. "You look a bit troubled, young man. Are you waiting for the Hogwarts Express?" he asked. Harry nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, but I can't find Platform 9 Thworsers, and I've missed all the other trains." The mother smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, that platform only appears when you know where to look. You just run straight at that solid brick wall between platforms 9 and 10. She pointed across a few paces at the barrier. "When you reach it, don't even slow down." Harry's eyes widened. "Run. Right at it?" "Exactly," the father confirmed. "It's a little startling the first time, but you'll vanish through the wall and emerge on the other side." Harry hurried across, heart thumping. He took a deep breath, then ran full tilt at the wall. In a sudden whoosh, he felt himself pushed forward, like stepping through a curtain of air. A moment later, he stumbled onto a new platform, lined with an endless scarlet train. "Welcome to Platform 9 Thwor," called the wizard family from the other side of the wall, waving. Relief flooded Harry. He grabbed his trunk trolley and pulled onto the platform, only to find the Hogwarts Express already swarming with boarding students. Nearly every compartment was full. Harry circled the train, his gaze flicking from window to window, but all he saw were chattering classmates and overflowing luggage racks. At last, near the rear of the train, he found an unsealed carriage door. With a resigned sigh, he squeezed himself in, shoulders brushing other students' coats. There, on a narrow seat by the window, Harry sank down, finally safe and more excited than ever to be heading to Hogwarts. Harry winced as the heavy trunk slipped from his grip and slammed down on his foot. Pain flared through him, but he pressed his lips together, determined to try again. He took a steadying breath and hauled once more, only to stumble backward as the trunk came crashing down a second time. Before he could curse the throbbing ache in his foot, a firm hand shot out and caught the crate's corner, stopping it inches above the step. Harry looked up to see a tall stranger with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "Need a hand?" the man offered, and with surprising ease he lifted the trunk onto the staircase. Harry's heart fluttered with relief. Strangers who helped weren't something he was used to. Growing up with the Dursleys, he had been taught not to expect kindness. At home, he'd slept in a cramped cupboard under the stairs, sharing space with dusty spiders instead of a real bedroom. If he ever misbehaved, Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon punished him by withholding meals. His cousin Dudley, a spoiled bully, tormented him at every turn. At school, things weren't any better. Dudley's reputation as the neighborhood terror followed Harry everywhere. No one dared befriend the boy who lived with Mr. and Mrs. Dursley's monstrous son. Over and over, Harry had learned that the world offered him little more than sneers, punishments, and loneliness. So when the stranger set down the trunk and flashed him that friendly grin, Harry wasn't sure what to say. All he could do was stare, half in shock, half in gratitude, at someone who'd just shown him an ounce of kindness. Dudley was the only one brazen enough to yank down his pants in front of everyone, and the only one to pull them back up for his friends when they went to the loo. It was common knowledge that he loathed Harry more than anyone else, so nobody dared cross Dudley's gang. Over the years, Harry had quietly retreated into himself. Yet, at this very moment, standing before a new classmate, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in ages. The boy facing him was slim and confident, with pale gray eyes that shone beneath a mop of dark hair and a long, slightly hooked nose that gave him a hawk-like air. He handled his trunk with such ease that Harry found himself strangely at ease too. The last time he'd been this calm was on his 11th birthday, when the giant Rubus Hagrid first arrived, handed him his Hogwarts letter, and told him he was a wizard. "I'm Sherlock Holmes," the boy said, smiling and extending a hand. "First year, like you. And you are?" Harry's heart thudded. "Hello, Holmes. I'm Harry Potter, also a first year." He reached out, then, in his nervousness, awkwardly offered both hands before realizing his mistake. His cheeks burned as he quickly dropped one, bracing himself for a laugh. Sherlock only smiled again, warm and unfazed, and Harry felt, for the first time in a long while, that he might just belong. Sherlock arrived at the station early, determined not to miss the boy he'd never met. Admittedly, Harry Potter had little social experience and might be too shy to speak up, afraid someone would mock him. Of course, Sherlock would never dream of doing that, but the thought still made him smile. Locating Harry on a crowded platform was no simple task. By arriving ahead of time, Sherlock had already dismissed the faces waiting before the train pulled in. All that remained were those who stepped off in the final moments. It was only then that he saw the boy, standing alone, shoulders slumped, exhaustion etched into his pale features. For the celebrated hero who'd saved the wizarding world, it seemed odd. Even if Harry had grown up without his parents, you'd expect half a dozen, 8 or even 10, friends or well-wishers to see him off. Here, however, he was entirely by himself. Sherlock hesitated, briefly wondering if he'd made a mistake. Then he recalled his own maxim: when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Harry Potter had indeed been raised in the Muggle world, and no one from the magical community had accompanied him today. That realization only deepened Sherlock's fascination with the boy before him. "Just call me Sherlock," the boy said, offering Harry his hand. "It's crowded up front. Let's sit here, Potter. Or, can I call you Harry?" "Okay," Harry managed, voice a little shaky. Before he fully registered what was happening, Sherlock had guided him into a corner seat by the window and gently nudged him into place. Then he tossed in his own trunk, carefully laid Hedwig, the great snowy owl, on top, and settled himself beside Harry. Even though they'd only just met, Harry felt a warm relief at Sherlock's considerate gesture. Stepping onto the Hogwarts Express was overwhelming enough on its own. Having someone reach out like this made him feel less alone. His heart hammered as the train lurched forward, carrying him deeper into the wizarding world. For a moment, he let himself imagine. What if he could stick by Sherlock's side forever? Compared to his cousin Dudley, this calm, capable boy seemed far more like the big brother Harry had always longed for. If Sherlock hadn't told him his age, Harry would have sworn he was an upper-year student. Once they were settled, Sherlock glanced at him with those piercing blue eyes. "You look like you're not doing so well." Those 7 words hit Harry harder than he expected. In that carriage, surrounded by trunks and Hedwig's soft hoots, he felt an irresistible urge to confide in Sherlock, his first true friend in this strange new world. Sherlock's steady, encouraging gaze gave Harry the courage to unburden himself. He recounted everything, the lonely years spent hopping from one relative's home to the next, the uncertainty that dogged him every step of the way, and the small hopes that kept him going. Sherlock sat perfectly still, nodding at all the right moments and slipping in a few questions to clarify details. When Harry finally paused, Sherlock steepled his fingers and offered a satisfied smile. "So," he said, "your guardian dropped you off at the station this morning and left immediately. You didn't know which platform you needed, so you asked strangers for directions, and that's how you managed to catch the right train." "Exactly," Harry exclaimed, then froze. "But how did you know? I never said it was my guardian, let alone that he was an uncle, and I certainly didn't mention struggling to find the platform." Harry's wide-eyed stare was precisely the reaction Sherlock had come to expect. In the early days, he delighted in watching people's jaws drop as he walked them through his chain of evidence. The way Harry's sleeve was dirtier on one side, the crease in his pocket that suggested a rough journey, even the scuff on his shoes where he'd been pacing in confusion. Back then, every astonished look only fueled his sense of superiority. But after so many outings of "I knew it, and that's incredible," the thrill had worn off. Now, it barely registered beyond a mild amusement at human predictability. He leaned back in his chair. "Let's just say I have a habit of noticing the small things," he replied lightly, then turned his attention back to the fireplace, leaving Harry to bask or fume in the afterglow of deduction. He'd come to regard this skill as so routine, it no longer deserved any fanfare. In his mind, anyone with enough dedication could reach his level. Clearly, though, not everyone saw it that way, especially Harry, standing before him with an expression of genuine surprise. Sherlock realized that if he didn't break things down in plain terms, their easy conversation would stall before it even got started. Chapter 11. Green Light. "Actually, it's quite simple to work all this out," Sherlock said, tapping Harry's broken spectacles. He glanced over the taped-up frames. "No caring family would let you start a new school term wearing glasses held together with clear tape. Yet here you are." He shifted his gaze down to Harry's robes. "Your clothes are neat, proof you know how to look after yourself, but they're dated and far too large, clearly hand-me-downs from someone bigger than you, probably a cousin." He pointed to the battered trunk at Harry's feet. "And that case has seen years of use, scuffed and worn. If it belonged to a cousin, then your guardian must be an aunt or uncle. According to the entries in the rise and fall of the dark arts and important magical events of the 20th century, the only relative you have left is your mother's sister. So you live with your aunt and uncle, people who clearly don't care much about you." Harry stared at Sherlock in disbelief. "Hold on. Did you say those books mention me?" Sherlock fixed Harry with a steady look. "It seems you haven't read the books as carefully as I have. Otherwise, there'd be very little about you I didn't already know." Harry's eyes widened. Sherlock's lips curved into a slight smile. "Not just those 2 books, either. Bathilda Bagshot's A History of Magic, the standard first-year textbook, mentions you too." A wave of dizziness washed over Harry. He gripped the edge of the desk and found his voice. "Then, how did you know my Uncle Vernon brought me here today?" Sherlock raised an eyebrow. "I was just about to explain, if you hadn't interrupted." Harry's face went red. "Sorry." "Apology accepted," Sherlock said, "but do let me finish. Look at the lower right corner of your robes." He pointed to a faint crease. "See this mark? That's the exact kind of abrasion you get when a car door swings shut against fabric. The angle, the pressure, it all matches a right-hand door. Now, your precise speech and your own story. Being someone who prides himself on punctuality, tell me you wouldn't have been late unless you'd been driven. Therefore, your late arrival can only have been thanks to your uncle's car." Harry stared at him, stunned into silence, as Sherlock's deduction hung in the air. "You couldn't even lift your trunk on your own back there," Sherlock began, his words tumbling out in a rapid-fire stream. "Combine that with your exacting description of your dreadful relative, and it's obvious what he was up to. He never intended to help you. He dragged you to the station just to watch you struggle. For anyone new to the wizarding world, finding Platform 90 course hidden between Platforms 9 and 10 is nearly impossible without a keen eye. From the way you hesitated, I knew you lacked that skill. You must have had help getting through the barrier." He paused, though Harry suspected Sherlock had already deduced more than he'd said. After all, Sherlock had spotted him the instant he appeared on the platform, and had quietly worked out who had guided him through the wall. Harry stared at him in disbelief for a long moment. Finally, he whispered, "That's incredible." Sherlock simply shrugged, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He honestly didn't think such a trivial trick was worth boasting about. In fact, Sherlock's modesty only made Harry admire him more. Just as Harry was about to offer another compliment, the compartment's sliding door creaked open, and a mop of red hair poked inside. "Excuse me," said the boy, ducking his head through the opening. "All the other seats are taken. Could I sit in here?" Harry glanced at Sherlock. The boy followed his gaze, eyes flicking to Sherlock's calm face. "By all means, Mr. Weasley," Sherlock replied. "Thanks." Ron Weasley shouldered his trunk into the cramped space and settled onto the bench. Then he froze, staring in sudden realization. "Hang on, how did you know who I am?" Sherlock raised a single finger, and Harry leaned forward, curious. "If you really want to keep your name under wraps," Sherlock said coolly, "you might try not hanging a luggage tag on your trunk. Or at least don't point it directly at whoever you're talking to." Ron's face fell as he looked down at his own brightly colored tag. He'd completely forgotten it was there. In that moment, Harry felt a wave of relief. It wasn't that Ron was dim. It was Sherlock who was simply astonishing. Harry let out a quiet sigh of relief when the other boy chose to sit beside him. Truth be told, Harry suspected it was Sherlock's overwhelming presence at the opposite end of the table that drove him here, into Harry's more comfortable orbit. The red-haired boy's hands trembled slightly as he settled into the seat, and Harry recognized in his new companion the same nervous energy he'd felt only moments ago. Across from them, Sherlock sat perfectly composed, his aura radiating complete command. In that moment, he held all the initiative. Yet even as Sherlock regarded Harry with cool detachment, his curiosity shifted to the boy at his side. From the records he'd studied, the Weasleys were one of the legendary Sacred 28, pure-blood wizards whose families had shaped the magical world for centuries. Their trademark red hair made them unmistakable in any crowd. Sherlock had initially planned to use Harry Potter, famed as the boy who lived but raised among muggles, as his guide to this new realm. Instead, he discovered that Harry's years at Hogwarts hadn't taught him much more than Sherlock himself had gleaned in a month of intensive study. In contrast, the Weasley heir promised to be a far richer source of insight. "I'm Sherlock Holmes. Just call me Sherlock." He paused, then pointed across the aisle. "And this," he announced, "is Harry Potter." Ron's quill slipped from his fingers. "Harry Potter? Wait, did you say he's Harry Potter? The Harry Potter?" His voice shot up an octave, then he clapped a hand over his mouth. Sorry, he mumbled, sinking into his seat. "I mean, you're Harry Potter?" Harry's cheeks flushed scarlet under Ron's incredulous gaze, and he couldn't muster a word. Sherlock gave him a knowing look. "Yes, he is." Both boys relaxed in unison. Harry let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and offered Sherlock a grateful nod. Ron, still staring in disbelief, whispered, "I can't believe I'm sharing a compartment with Harry Potter." Sherlock watched Ron's wide-eyed expression with fascination. He'd read about Harry's legendary status, of course, but seeing it in action, now that was infinitely more entertaining. Harry swept his hair back, revealing the lightning bolt scar on his forehead. Sherlock and Ron leaned closer. Ron's eyes went wide. "You know who did that?" Harry nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, but I don't remember it." "You don't remember anything at all?" Ron pressed. Only a burst of green light. That's all I recall. Green light? Sherlock echoed. The killing curse? Harry shook his head. I'm not sure. A tense silence settled over them. Chapter 12. You have 5 brothers. Once all the young wizards had taken their seats, the Hogwarts Express eased out of the station, and the countryside outside blurred into a rolling ribbon of green. Harry and Ron, who had been politely reserved when they first met, now sat side by side, chattering excitedly. Harry was eager to learn about Ron's large, boisterous family. Ron was equally fascinated by Harry's mysterious past. Question after question came fast and furious, and with each answer, their friendship deepened. Sherlock, who shared their compartment, listened silently. He didn't need to join the conversation. Every detail they offered allowed him to reconstruct their lives with the precision of a trained detective. But what truly held his attention was Harry's lightning-shaped scar, though to Sherlock's eye it resembled more a neat capital N than a jagged bolt. He regarded it thoughtfully, as though committing its angles and curves to memory. Meanwhile, Ron's enthusiasm reached a crescendo. He cracked open his battered trunk, rummaging around until he produced a small gray rat. George taught me a spell to change its color, he announced, beaming. Watch this. He plucked up Scabbers and adjusted his glasses. Harry and Sherlock leaned forward. Ron said, Scourgify. No, wait, that's cleaning. Ah, say it with me. Florio, he faltered, then tried again. Floridiscabbers. At once, Scabbers' fur turned a brilliant canary yellow. The rat let out a startled squeak, prompting Harry to break into delighted laughter. Sherlock allowed himself the smallest of smiles, clearly impressed by the flawless execution and the rat's vivid transformation. You really do have 5 brothers? Harry asked Ron, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. Ron nodded, still holding the now yellow rodent. 6, actually. Bill's the eldest, then Charlie, Percy, me, then Fred and George. Fred and George are twins, of course, which means twice the trouble and twice the fun. Harry glanced at Sherlock, whose interest had definitively shifted from the scar to the spectacle before him. I'd love to meet them someday, Harry said. It sounds like your house is never quiet. Quiet? Ron scoffed. You have no idea. As laughter and chatter filled the compartment, the Hogwarts Express raced on toward its destination, and a new year of magic, mayhem, and discoveries. Ron's trunk was a disaster zone. He shoved aside a teetering stack of books, unearthed a couple of ratty robes, and after what felt like forever, finally withdrew a wand. He held it up triumphantly. Want to see it? Harry and Sherlock leaned in. Come on, show us. Harry urged, eyes bright. Sherlock gave Ron a curious once-over. He'd heard about Ron's summer, dozens of spells practiced, all reported successes. By all rights, the boy should be a natural at magic. But transfiguration, turning one object into another, like Professor McGonagall turning teacups into squirrels, was notoriously advanced. Even after skimming the textbooks, Sherlock knew it wasn't a first-year subject. Under their expectant stares, Ron cleared his throat, planted his feet, and aimed his wand at Scabbers, who was curled up and snoozing in the trunk's corner. Daisies, sweet butter, and sunshine. Turn this stupid fat rat yellow. 1, 2, 3. Still nothing. Scabbers didn't stir. His fur remained the same dull gray. Harry's eyebrows shot up. Sherlock's lips twitched in a skeptical half-smile. Ron frowned, squared his shoulders, and tried again. Daisies, sweet butter, and sunshine. Turn this stupid fat rat yellow. But the rat stayed stubbornly gray, dreaming on. Ron's shoulders slumped as Harry and Sherlock exchanged bemused looks. Magic, it seemed, wasn't always as straightforward as a summer's practice made it seem. Ron tossed his wand aside with a sigh. This spell's useless. I'm sure George knew it wouldn't work. He gave the battered stick a disappointed look before slipping it back into his pocket. Sherlock glanced down at the old wand. Is that the problem? He asked, nodding toward Ron's hand. Ron groaned. What do you mean? Sherlock lifted his chin and pointed. The wand's finish was peeling, and the exposed wood at the tip shone a dull white. Your second brother's wand, yes? For a moment, Ron's eyes darted over the wand as if seeing it for the first time. Oh, that, he said with forced nonchalance. It's Charlie's old wand. The unicorn hair core is almost spent, but Dad insisted it wouldn't affect its performance. He trailed off, one hand absently tracing the worn handle. Then he looked up in surprise. Wait, how did you know it belonged to Charlie? Harry, standing just behind them, grinned. Well, it's obvious the wand's ancient, but deducing it's Ron's second brothers? That's quite the leap. Ron gave Harry a startled look. I haven't even mentioned how many brothers I have. Sherlock simply smiled, as though he'd anticipated every question. Sherlock leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips as he tapped the wand laid out before him. Let's see, he began. This isn't your wand. It belongs to your second brother, and you're one of 7 siblings in total. Right now, you're wearing your eldest brother's robes, carrying your second brother's wand, and your third brother's familiar is by your side. Your fourth and fifth brothers are twins, and you still have a younger sister who hasn't even started at Hogwarts yet. For a long moment, Harry and Ron simply stared at him, mouths agape. Neither could find a word. Finally, Ron's cheeks colored bright red as he stammered, Sherlock, that's not fair. You must have investigated my family before we arrived. Harry jumped to his friend's defense. Yeah, Sherlock. There's no way you could have just guessed any of that about Ron's family unless you already knew it. The two boys exchanged triumphant looks, convinced they'd uncovered Sherlock's secret research. Sherlock regarded them calmly, amusement glinting in his eyes. Gentlemen, he said, these deductions aren't the result of prior snooping. They're simply the fruit of careful observation and logical reasoning. With enough patience and attention, either of you could make the same inferences. Think back to my analysis of you earlier, Harry. When you break it down, it's all remarkably straightforward. He paused, allowing them a moment to absorb what he'd said, then added with a quiet confidence, and with practice, you'll get there too. When I walk you through my deductions, you'll no doubt say, "Ah, it's that simple." Harry gave a half smile. Really? I find that hard to believe, Ron interjected, shaking his head. You must have done some snooping before we arrived. Harry's eyebrows shot up. After all, he'd already witnessed Sherlock's uncanny powers once before. But now, even he felt a twinge of doubt. The conclusions Sherlock had just drawn from Ron's appearance alone were far more detailed than the one he'd made about Harry himself. Sensing their impatience, Sherlock spread his hands in a calming gesture. Very well, he said. I'll explain. Everything you're carrying, your robe, your textbooks, your wand, even the trunk you lug around, shows signs of long use. That suggests you come from a large family where hand-me-downs are the norm. In fact, when you opened your trunk just now, I couldn't help but notice how worn the leather edges were. Your robe has been taken in at the seams. See how the stitching puckers near the shoulders? And it's slightly too short, which means it's been passed down and altered more than once. If you slip it on later, I predict your sneakers will peek out from under the hem. Sherlock paused, letting that sink in. And then there's your wand, too scuffed, too familiar. Harry even noticed it a moment ago. Harry's jaw dropped. What? But that doesn't prove the wand belonged to my brother, Ron shot back defensively. Second brother or not, it could have been yours, Harry. Sherlock shrugged. Generally, students purchase their wands and robes at the same time, but your wand looks almost brand new while your robes are noticeably more worn. That tells me you bought the robes before you got the wand. In our world, departing students often pass down their robes, and sometimes their wands, to younger siblings still at school, but only after they've graduated. So your two brothers must have finished their schooling already. Then there's the matter of scabbers. When you showed me that little spell, you mentioned your prefect brother gave him to you, and that George taught you the charm. That adds at least 2 more brothers to the count. And just now on the train, I saw you chatting with a pair of twins, same red hair, same features. There's no doubt they're your brothers. Yet neither of them was in a prefect's compartment, which, as you know, are the 2 front cars. Those are easy to spot. Put all those pieces together, wands and robes, scabbers, George, the twins, and the answer's pretty straightforward, isn't it? See, it's straightforward once you lay out the clues. You have 5 brothers. Your robe came from your eldest brother, your wand from your second, both already graduated. Your pet, that belongs to your third brother, who's a prefect, and the pair of identical brothers left must be your 4th and 5th. He stumbled over his words. But how did you know I have a sister? She smiled. You might not have noticed, but there are a few strands of red hair on your shoulder. From the shade and texture, she seems about your age. So you must have a sister, either older or younger, but a younger sister makes more sense. That last part was a guess, not a deduction, but I'm willing to bet I'm right. She hasn't started school yet, has she? Chapter 13. Goodbye, Hermione Granger. Sherlock barely paused for breath as he finished his deduction. Harry and Ron stood frozen, mouths agape. Harry, having already witnessed Sherlock's uncanny talents, recovered first. "That was brilliant, Sherlock," Harry exclaimed. "You're extraordinary. Now that you've explained it, it seems so obvious." Sherlock allowed himself a faint, satisfied smile. "I had a feeling you'd say that, Harry." He then shifted his gaze to Ron, his tone turning earnest. "Ron, if you can swing it, you ought to get yourself a new wand. Hand-me-down robes and books are one thing, but a wand needs to fit you. Otherwise, you'll struggle with charms and other spells." Ron's cheeks flushed. "It's all right," he muttered. "Even though it's old, my brother's wand works just fine." Sherlock noted the unstated truth. Ron didn't have the galleons for a replacement. Harry and Ron, both deeply impressed, quickly seized the moment. They peppered Sherlock with questions, and it was then they learned that his process was called the deductive method, a disciplined approach grounded in careful observation, systematic analysis, and rigorous logic. They'd been talking about the art of deduction, how it hinges on keen observation, a solid base of knowledge, and the careful interplay of induction and deduction. Sherlock had insisted that anyone could learn it with enough practice. Harry and Ron, though, exchanged doubtful glances. "Come on," Harry said. "You can't train someone to see things like that. It's a gift, not a course you can enroll in." Ron grunted in agreement, shaking his head. Their conversation was growing more animated when a series of light taps rang on the compartment door. Harry started, and Sherlock straightened. The door slid open, revealing two young witches. Behind them stood a small boy with a round, freckled face, mouth trembling, eyes red-rimmed. Sherlock's expression sharpened. He knew this boy from earlier that afternoon, when he'd been waiting alone on the station platform. Back then, Sherlock had mentally filed away a quick profile. First-year student, orphaned or at least separated from parents for unknown reasons. Raised by grandmother, somewhat forgetful, shy, lacking confidence. Now, as the boy hesitated in the doorway, his tear-streaked face spoke volumes without a single word. Harry and Ron didn't need Sherlock's notes to understand. Something terrible had happened, and he felt both wronged and afraid. Sherlock rose smoothly to his feet. "Come in," he said gently, stepping aside. The boy slipped in, flanked by his two classmates, and closed the door with a soft click. The three friends shifted to make room, their earlier debate forgotten as they turned their attention to the newcomer. Ready to help, ready to listen, and ready to apply that very art of deduction he claimed anyone could learn. Hermione Granger stepped into the courtyard next, her long brown hair brushing the shoulders of her freshly starched robes. Her prominent front teeth and haughty expression made her look every bit the confident, and, to Ron at least, slightly arrogant, young witch Sherlock had spotted outside the leaky cauldron before classes began. "Has anyone seen a toad?" she called, voice crisp. Neville Longbottom's gone and lost his. Ron's scowl deepened at her brisk tone. Harry merely raised an eyebrow. Before either of them could answer, Hermione's question was met by a calm, familiar voice. "We haven't seen a toad, Miss Granger." Harry and Ron whirled toward the speaker. Sherlock stood there, hands tucked into his robe pockets, looking unruffled as ever. Ron's jaw dropped. "Wait, how did you know it was Hermione?" he blurted. "She didn't even bring a trunk." He squared his shoulders and peered at her, hunting for the sort of telltale clues Sherlock always toyed with. But there was nothing, no secret token, no coded insignia, just a girl in robes who couldn't help looking a little pleased with herself. Sherlock shook his head. "We've met before." Harry and Ron exchanged relieved glances. All that tens, Ion, and Ron had half feared Sherlock would unmask her identity in the blink of an eye, just as he had with that cat earlier. That, they agreed, would have been a little too extraordinary. Hermione spotted Sherlock across the table and felt a flicker of surprise. She'd only met him once before, and even for someone as outgoing as Hermione Granger, his uncanny composure and sharp gaze had been intimidating at first. A month had passed, and she'd long since shaken off her initial shyness. Bounding over with a bright smile, she announced, "Holmes, what are you doing here?" Harry and Ron exchanged puzzled looks, and Sherlock himself raised an eyebrow. Had Hermione really warmed up to him so quickly? Their only prior meeting had been brief. But Hermione was nothing if not enthusiastic. She dropped into the empty seat beside Sherlock and continued without missing a beat. "Oh, I meant to call and ask. Have you finished reading those textbooks? I got completely sidetracked and forgot." Sherlock inclined his head slightly, his tone calm and measured. "Yes, I've finished them." Hermione's face lit up. "I knew it," she exclaimed. Leaning forward, she launched into rapid-fire chatter. "So, have you tried any of the spells yet? I practiced a few simple charms at home, just for fun, and they all worked perfectly. Actually, I forgot to mention earlier, no one in my family can do magic. So when I got my acceptance letter, I was completely taken aback, though I was over the moon too. From everything I've heard, this is the best magic school in the world. I've already memorized every textbook cover to cover. Now I just hope I can put all that knowledge to good use." Once Hermione started talking, her words tumbled out in an unstoppable rush. Harry and Ron exchanged a knowing look. Just as they'd silently sized up Neville Longbottom earlier, they both immediately grasped what kind of person Hermione was, even before Sherlock had a chance to analyze her. Ron rolled his eyes inwardly. No matter which house Hermione ended up in, he thought, I do not want her in mine. At that moment, Hermione's gaze flicked to the wand Ron was still holding and not yet tucked away. "Oh, you've got your wand out. Are you going to cast a spell? Do it for us." Ron's stomach lurched. His last attempt at magic had backfired spectacularly. He'd been humiliated right in front of Harry and Sherlock, who he already considered his people. But performing in front of Hermione Granger and Neville Longbottom, that felt like an even taller order. He glanced helplessly at Neville, whose round face was streaked with tears, then back at Hermione, whose eyes now sparkled with challenge. Panic rising, Ron turned to Sherlock with an almost pleading look, silently begging for rescue. At that moment, Harry turned to Sherlock with pleading eyes. "Please help us, Sherlock," he urged. Sherlock, sensing their silent appeal, nodded and assessed the situation. "It looks like your glasses need more than tape," he observed, reaching for his wand. With a precise flick, he took aim at the battered frames perched on Harry's nose and murmured, "Reparo." A soft tinkle filled the air as the broken lenses snapped back into place and the twisted sides of the frames straightened themselves, restoring the glasses to their original, factory-fresh condition. Harry stared in astonishment, carefully removing the spectacles to inspect every flawless hinge and spotless lens. Beside him, Ron leaned in, unable to hide his amazement at the transformation. Hermione, too, stared at Sherlock in surprise. She knew the Reparo charm well. After all, she was usually the one to mend their mishaps, but she had never seen it performed with such effortless precision. Memories of Sherlock's earlier astonishing deduction at the leaky cauldron, when he correctly guessed that her parents were doctors, surfaced in her mind. For the first time, the brightest witch of her age felt a flicker of uncertainty about how much more there might be to learn. Hermione cleared her throat, intending to comment on the charm Sherlock had just performed. Then, as Harry removed his glasses, her eyes caught the lightning-shaped scar on his forehead. She froze. "Are you Harry Potter?" she whispered. "The boy who defeated Lord Voldemort?" Harry's hand stilled on the edge of the table. For a heartbeat, he seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he managed, "Yes. Well, I am Harry Potter." But he swallowed. "Voldemort isn't really dead. Hagrid says he's alive, though too weak to pose any real threat right now." Sherlock frowned, intrigued. He exchanged a quick glance with Hermione. "You're saying Voldemort survived? Despite everything we've heard?" Harry nodded. "That's what Hagrid told me. He said Voldemort lost most of his power, but he's still out there somewhere." As Harry, Sherlock, and Hermione launched into a hushed but animated discussion about the implications, Ron and Neville sat beside them like statues, utterly silent, their faces pale, hands trembling in their laps. Neither dared speak, caught between relief and fresh alarm at the revelation. Chapter 14. The One Who Must Not Be Named. The last carriage of the Hogwarts Express was surprisingly cramped that morning. Sherlock Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Harry and Hermione as they pored over a sheaf of tattered parchment. From their spirited tone, Neville Longbottom could tell they were discussing something extraordinary. So extraordinary, in fact, that he'd completely forgotten about his missing toad, Trevor. He'd been rifling through his bag one moment, and then found himself staring slack-jawed as Hermione casually spoke a name that made his spine tingle. Harry nodded eagerly. Yes, Voldemort himself triggered the wards at Malfoy Manor. We have to be ready. Neville coughed, hoping to draw their attention. A dozen times he opened his mouth to object, but each time the words turned to dust in his throat. Across from him, Ron Weasley shifted uncomfortably, his cheeks pale. Finally, Ron could stand it no longer. He swallowed and blurted out, "Wait a minute. You actually said it. You just called him Voldemort." Sherlock glanced up, curious. "Why not? That name's taboo," Ron whispered, staring as though Sherlock had grown a second head. Neville joined in, his voice trembling. "We don't say it aloud. You mustn't." Sherlock cocked an eyebrow. "Are you very frightened of a name?" A hush fell over the little compartment. Across from them, Hermione swallowed hard, and Harry's eyes narrowed. Even after more than a decade, the power of that single word still sent ripples through the wizarding world. But here and now, on this rattling train bound for Hogwarts, the name was no longer cloaked in fear. Spoken out loud, it rang with the promise of a confrontation long overdue. Hermione watched Ron and Neville nodding vigorously beside her, curiosity brimming in her eyes. "Why are we supposed to be afraid of saying his name?" she asked at last. Ron opened his mouth as if to speak, then hesitated, searching for the right words. After a moment, he sighed. "My mom and dad used it to scare me when I was little. In every wizarding family, parents tell their kids that his name is taboo, never to be spoken out loud. You only say it if it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, you call him you-know-who." Neville's head bobbed in agreement. He looked grave, as though recalling his own childhood warnings. Ron turned to Harry, awe shining in his eyes. "Makes sense, though," he added. "After all, it's you we're talking about." Harry paused, then met their gazes. "I'm not brave," he admitted softly. I never knew there was a rule against saying his name. Nobody ever told me." Hermione's face softened into a thoughtful smile. "Of course, if you weren't raised in a wizarding family, you wouldn't know about the fear that grew up around that name." She couldn't help thinking that, if anything, her own mum's voice booming her full name in the morning was more terrifying than you-know-who ever could be. "Anything can be said. Nothing is off limits." Sherlock's voice was calm, almost gentle, as Harry, Hermione, Ron, and Neville stared at him in surprise. "Fear springs from the unknown," he went on, "and the best way to dispel fear is to confront it head-on." Ron and Neville shrank back in their seats like startled birds, but Sherlock simply offered them a solution. Face your fear directly. Harry and Hermione exchanged determined looks and nodded. Ron and Neville, though impressed by Sherlock's logic, felt the weight of their lifelong conditioning holding them back. Hermione and Neville lingered in the compartment, discussing strategy, until the door slid open and a smiling trolley witch peered in. "Who'd like a snack?" Hermione stood. "Come on, Neville, let's keep looking for Trevor." As they gathered their things, Hermione turned to Ron. "Honestly, you need a new wand. Using an old one almost guarantees a misfired spell." Ron's jaw tightened. When Sherlock had suggested the same thing, he'd shrugged it off. But hearing it from Hermione stung. He watched her and Neville slip away, fuming inwardly. Once the compartment door clicked shut, Ron muttered, "I don't care which house I'm in, just not the same one as her." He leaned back, satisfied that at least he'd voiced his true feelings. Harry nodded absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed on Sherlock. This new friend was extraordinary. Already, Sherlock had stepped up to the street vendor's cart, eyeing the unfamiliar treats with keen curiosity. Even at a glance, the small pastries and confections seemed infused with magic, exactly the sort of detail that had drawn him into the wizarding world in the first place. "Did you bring food?" Sherlock asked, turning to Harry and Ron. Harry shook his head. The Dursleys never let him starve, but they certainly never let him eat his fill. His cousin Dudley was all too eager to snatch away any tasty morsel Harry managed to procure. So Harry hadn't expected a proper lunch from them. Ron shifted from foot to foot and mumbled that he did have sandwiches, his cheeks coloring at Sherlock's look. Sherlock understood immediately. Ron needed extra provisions. He quietly asked the vendor for prices, then selected a bit of everything on display: crisps, sweet fruit chews, tiny meat pies, and a few sparkling pastries. When he handed over his coins, the total came to just under 12 silver sickles. Not ridiculously expensive, but not a bargain either. With their snacks in hand, the three boys found a spot on the grassy verge beside the cart. As they settled down, Harry couldn't help but feel exhilarated. Here, in the heart of Diagon Alley, every mundane detail shimmered with possibility, especially when Sherlock Holmes was around. "I'm treating everyone to a meal," Sherlock announced, "but since all I have are snacks, Ron, how about you hand over your sandwich first? I'm starving." Ron's face lit up at the suggestion. His mother always forgot that he hated corned beef, so the idea of swapping his sandwich for something more to his taste was perfect. Besides, he'd much rather snack on sweets than choke down cold meat. He nodded eagerly. Harry glanced between them, a shy smile pulling at his lips. He swallowed and nodded too. This was the first time someone his own age had offered to share food with him, and the simple kindness caught him off guard. As they settled on a bench by the hedge, Sherlock watched them with keen interest. Harry, he'd realized, seemed reserved and withdrawn at first, but beneath that quiet exterior lay real courage and self-assurance. He could accept generosity without overthinking it. Ron, by contrast, appeared laid back and joking, yet lived in the constant shadow of 5 brilliant older brothers. Direct offers of kindness made him self-conscious, but an exchange, a trade, felt perfectly fair. Sherlock handed Ron a chocolate eclair in exchange for the sandwich, then bit into it with relish. Ron beamed as he took the corned beef roll, happy to have avoided it, while Harry munched on a freshly baked scone Sherlock had set aside just for him. The trio sat in companionable silence, each warmed by the unexpected moment of fellowship. Sherlock wasn't exaggerating when he said he needed a proper meal before settling for snacks. To his delight, Mrs. Weasley's cooking proved every bit as good as he'd hoped. The beef was tender and richly flavored. Soon the three of them were tucking in, and the warm, savory aroma filled the train compartment, making the journey feel downright festive. As they ate, Ron enthusiastically introduced Sherlock and Harry to an array of magical treats. He handed them a chocolate frog and explained that, contrary to its name, it wasn't an actual amphibian, but a molded chocolate bar with a velvety, milk-infused filling. The confection was astonishingly smooth, the kind of melt-in-your-mouth delight that young witches and wizards craved. Yet it wasn't just the taste that captured Sherlock and Harry's attention. It was the collectible cards tucked into each package. Every chocolate frog came with a card bearing the portrait of a famous figure from the wizarding world on one side and a brief biography on the other. Harry unwrapped his to find Albus Dumbledore gazing back at him. Unlike photographs in the non-magical world, these images weren't static. Dumbledore gave a subtle nod and a twinkle in his eye, as if to welcome Harry back to Hogwarts. Harry barely had time to finish reading the little biography on the back of the chocolate frog card when he flipped it over and froze. The portrait of Dumbledore had vanished. "What the?" Harry murmured. Ron leaned in. "What's up?" "The picture. He's gone." Ron gave an amused shrug. "Well, of course he is. These cards don't keep you on display indefinitely." Harry frowned. "But in the Muggle world, once you're in a photograph, you stay there for good." "That's just it," Ron said, eyes widening. "They don't move or change at all. You're basically trapped in time." He paused. "That's kind of brilliant, really." Before Harry could respond, a faint shimmer ran across the card, and there was Dumbledore again, his white beard bristling to life, his eyes twinkling. Harry's mouth fell open. "That's amazing, Sherlock. Aren't you surprised?" Sherlock calmly broke off a piece of the chocolate frog and let it melt on his tongue. "Delicious," he observed, then turned his attention to the card. The old wizard winked, as if greeting an old friend. Sherlock smiled, handing it back to Harry. "You know," he said, "you could achieve an effect very much like this without any magic at all." Chapter 15. Who is the alternative? Sherlock tapped the edge of his notebook thoughtfully. "You know," he began, "in 1987, a bitmap format called GIF was introduced by CompuServe." Harry and Ron stared. "A bitmap," Ron echoed. "What's that got to do with us?" Sherlock's dark eyes lit up. "A bitmap is a way of storing pictures as a grid of pixels. GIF stands for Graphics Interchange Format. You've probably seen them online. At first, GIFs could only display static images, much like the moving portraits here at Hogwarts. But in 1989, an enhancement allowed true animation, multiple frames in a single file, looping seamlessly. Harry's eyebrows shot up. So Muggles figured out moving pictures before we perfected those portrait animations? Precisely, Sherlock replied. In some respects, GIF technology even surpassed the magical portraits, at least in smoothness and variety of color. Harry and Ron exchanged amazed glances. It wasn't every day that a fellow third year could rattle off Muggle computing history as if reciting a charm. Sherlock really did seem to know everything, but that curious lecture was only a brief interlude. Soon enough, the real excitement began. Chocolate frog cards. After devouring their frogs, Harry and Sherlock triumphantly revealed Albus Dumbledore, each in their own collectible card. They spent the next hour trading with classmates, slowly filling out the sets. In the end, they each walked away with a remarkable haul. Morgan Le Fay, Hengist of Woodcroft, Alberic the Wise, Thoth the Atlantean, Paracelsus, and Merlin himself. Then luck struck. With a final, spectacular reveal, each of them pulled an SSR, an ultra-rare card. Harry's prize was Zhou Yan, the legendary Chinese alchemist from the Warring States period in the 4th century BC. Sherlock's was Kong Bo, a 15th century dragonologist credited with pioneering the use of powdered Chinese fireball dragon eggs in potions. Ron, watching their luck unfold, could only gape. "You two always pull the best cards," he grumbled, a hint of envy in his voice. Sherlock merely smiled, tucking his latest treasures safely into his robe pocket. Harry beamed beside him, adrenaline still buzzing from their stroke of fortune. For now, at least, they were the envy of the Great Hall. And though GIFs and dragonologists were worlds apart, in that moment they felt unstoppable. At Hogwarts, trading cards were the real currency. Some of the rarer ones could be worth a week's worth of homework. Sherlock's own Kongbo dragon card had come from his second brother, Charlie, who was currently studying dragons in Romania. Zhou Yan, on the other hand, had acquired his card through a trade arranged by his older brother. Sherlock mused that, in this respect, magic school wasn't all that different from any other school. Next, Ron warned Sherlock and Harry about another popular treat, Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans. And every flavor was exactly what you got. Alongside the familiar sweet tastes, chocolate, peppermint, marmalade, there were oddities like leather, paint, and dust. Even more stomach-churning were the novelty flavors, booger, earwax, and other, bodily secretions. Sherlock paused to consider that, with today's technology, the non-magical world could probably manufacture such flavors too, though he couldn't imagine why anyone would want to. Still, the exchange left him intrigued by the curious overlap between magic and science. Harry's resolve to pop that strange gray bean, so repulsive even Ron wouldn't touch it, had barely solidified when the compartment door slid open again. This time, 3 boys entered. In the middle stood a striking youth with pale, almost white blonde hair and sharply handsome features. His skin was so fair it verged on sickly, yet it only enhanced the ethereal quality of his good looks. Flanking him were 2 sturdy, broad-shouldered lads, one tall, one short, plain of face but clearly devoted. They moved with the subtle precision of bodyguards, instinctively keeping a protective distance around Tar, he pale boy. In their shadow, his beauty seemed to glow. Even Sherlock, unfazed by most things, found himself momentarily eclipsed. One cool glance was enough for Sherlock to identify them, the House of Malfoy. Like the red-haired Weasleys, the Malfoys were among the sacred 28 pure-blood families, only their signature hair was platinum rather than copper. And as Sherlock wasn't the only one who recognized the newcomer, a ripple of surprised whispers began to spread through the compartment. Sherlock noticed the exchange of glances between Harry and Ron, and his brow lifted in curiosity. "You know him?" he asked, turning to Harry. Ron snorted. "Malfoy? Of course I do." But Harry shook his head, puzzled, and yet, before he could stop himself, he found his own head nodding. The boy in question, the one with the pale face and platinum blonde hair, did look familiar. Harry had met him once before in Diagon Alley at Madame Malkin's Robes for All Occasions, both of them there to collect their Hogwarts uniforms. At the time, Malfoy had swaggered around with an air of superiority, sneering even at Hagrid, Harry's first true friend. Harry had wasted no time deciding he didn't like the boy. Now Malfoy gave Harry a long, amused stare. "Everyone on the train's been talking about Harry Potter being in this compartment," he drawled, arching an eyebrow. "So, it really is you, isn't it?" Harry swallowed, meeting those cool gray eyes, and managed a reluctant nod. Sherlock watched the brief scene, but made no move to intervene. After all, this was Harry's acquaintance, albeit a rather unwelcome one, and it seemed their own history would have to play out without his help. As Draco Malfoy strode into the compartment, his gray eyes swept over its occupants and came to rest on Sherlock, seated beside Harry Potter. A sneer curved his pale lips. "I never expected the famous Harry Potter to be sharing a carriage with a stinking mudblood," he drawled. "How unfortunate." Ron Weasley's face drained of color. Malfoy, barely pausing for breath, tilted his head back in that arrogant way of his and introduced himself. "I'm Draco Malfoy," he announced, "and these are my friends, Crabbe and Goyle." We couldn't help noticing. Before he could finish, Ron cut in with a low, contemptuous snort. Malfoy's eyes flicked to him, sharp with disgust. "Oh, do you find my words amusing?" he asked, voice mocking. "I don't even need to ask who you are. Red hair, threadbare robes, freckles scattered across your face, and a family bursting at the seams with children to feed. My father says the entire Weasley clan is nothing but a disgrace to pure bloods." Ron's grip tightened on his wand, crimson robes rustling. Harry shot Malfoy a warning look. He knew how quickly Ron could lose his temper, but Ron merely clenched his jaw. "Sherlock said the same things," Ron reminded himself, but she spoke plainly, as if listing facts. Malfoy's words dripped with contempt. He forced himself to breathe slowly, determined not to give the Slytherin the reaction he craved. Before Ron could launch into one of his trademark tirades, Malfoy wheeled back to Harry, plastered a strained smile on his face, and held out a gloved hand. "You'll find out soon enough, Potter," he said, voice oily and patronizing. "Some wizarding families are simply better than others. You don't want to be seen consorting with the wrong sort, or muddying your reputation with so-called Muggleborns, do you? I could set you straight." From his first word, Malfoy's upbringing showed through in every precise, disdainful tilt of his chin and every carefully measured syllable. If Hermione's confidence shone in her speech, Malfoy's arrogance radiated from his very posture. What stung most was that he'd just insulted two of the best friends Harry had made at Hogwarts. Harry's hand dropped to his side. He had no intention of humoring Malfoy's offer. "No thanks," he said coolly. "I think I can pick my own friends." Malfoy's smile stiffened and froze in place. A faint blush crept up his pale cheeks as he realized how orally he'd been rebuffed. Draco let his outstretched hand fall slowly to his side. With a sneer, he said, "Potter, if I were you, I'd be very careful. Don't end up following in your parents' footsteps, blinded by bad influences and mixed up with riffraff like the Weasleys or that half-giant Hagrid." The moment the words left Draco's mouth, Harry shot to his feet, eyes blazing. Ron rose beside him wordlessly, his cheeks flushing the same bright red as his hair. Chapter 16. Melee Wizard. Ron had known Harry for only a few weeks, but in that time he'd already come to think of him as a friend. So when Draco Malfoy sneered at Harry, and to add insult to injury, took jabs at Sherlock and Ron himself, Ron couldn't help but step forward. Harry, usually reserved and conflict-averse, fixed Malfoy with an icy stare. "Say that again." The words were measured, but their edge was unmistakable. Harry's parents were his sacred line in the sand. No one in their right mind insulted them, and Harry wouldn't tolerate it. Draco's smirk slipped for just a heartbeat, surprised by the pair's brazenness. Then he glanced at Crabbe and Goyle, standing loyally at his side, and let the sneer return. Noticing that Sherlock remained silent, Draco's contempt deepened. Mudbloods, he thought, were all skin and bone, spineless. Even a Weasley, despised among pure-blood circles, outshone his pathetic lackeys in talent. "Want to pick a fight?" Draco taunted, voice dripping with condescension. At his signal, Crabbe and Goyle lumbered forward, broad shoulders hunched, ready to back their master. They towered over Harry and Ron, but Harry's outward calm belied the racing in his chest. Despite the surge of adrenaline that sharpened his senses, part of him shook with every heartbeat. Ron squared his shoulders, wand at the ready. "We're not backing down." Malfoy laughed, low and cold. I wouldn't expect anything less from a pair of thrill-seeking little muggles. Harry's jaw tightened. He could feel Sherlock's steady gaze from the sidelines, supportive yet cautious. This confrontation wasn't just about pride, it was about defending those he cared for. For a moment the courtyard held its breath. Then Draco raised his wand, Crabbe and Goyle flanking him like two giant shadows. Ron mirrored his friend's gesture. Harry's grip on his wand was like steel. The first words of an incantation crackled in the air, and magic flared to life, igniting the showdown that would prove how far friendship and courage could carry them against pure-blood arrogance. Harry and Ron were at a clear disadvantage. Crabbe and Goyle towered over them, and all either boy could manage was a show of bravado. They were still only 11, after all, and their nervousness didn't go unnoticed. Crabbe and Goyle's sneers grew wider, convinced the two were nothing more than easy marks. Sherlock, meanwhile, was completely ignored, just another timid mudblood in their eyes, hardly worth a second glance. Confident they'd called the other's bluff, Goyle acted first. He stretched out his hand and snatched the chocolate frog sitting next to Ron. "Looks good, doesn't it?" Goyle sneered. "Too bad it's mine now. Let go." Ron's fear vanished the instant food was threatened. He lunged, only to be shoved to the floor before he even closed the gap. Goyle did it effortlessly, and Ron hit the ground with a thud. Harry stood frozen. Goyle was 2 heads taller, every bit as imposing as his cousin Dudley had been, and Harry felt that same old helplessness settle over him. He wanted to fight back, but years of bullying had locked his limbs in place. Harry watched Goyle, flanked by Draco Malfoy and his 2 cronies, tear open the packaging of a snack and felt a familiar pit of despair settle in his stomach. He'd been bullied before Hogwarts. Now it seemed the taunts followed him here too. Was any of this worth it? Just as Harry braced himself, Goyle's triumphant grin froze into a sharp cry. A firm hand clamped around his wrist, stopping him mid-rip. He thrashed wildly, but the grip held unyieldingly, like iron. "I say, boys." The calm voice belonged to Sherlock Holmes, who had quietly risen from the bench. He looked down at Goyle's trapped wrist and added, "Before you help yourselves to other people's things, don't you think it's polite to say hello?" Goyle doubled over, pain and disbelief etched across his face. Even seated, Sherlock had been tall. Now standing, he towered above the Slytherins, every bit the commanding figure. "Sherlock!" Draco Malfoy hiss. Stepping back. Harry exhaled the breath he'd been holding. Relief and admiration washed over him. Sherlock had never seemed so formidable. Beside him, Ron scrambled to his feet, eyes wide with surprise. He caught Harry's gaze, and in that shared look was pure gratitude. An authoritative voice rang out, "Let him go." At that moment, Crabbe snapped into action and charged at Sherlock. "Be careful," Harry yelled, finally shaking off his fear as he lunged forward to help. But before he could reach them, the situation had already shifted. Sherlock met Crabbe's onslaught with a calm nod. "All right," he said, and released his grip on Goyle's arm. Goyle instantly began to slump toward the floor, but before he hit the ground, Sherlock's fist shot up in a brutal uppercut to his chin. At the same time, Crabbe barreled in. With casual precision, Sherlock swept out a leg. Crabbe went down with a heavy thud, landing face first. Sherlock retracted his arm from Goyle, and as if it were no more than a light tap, added a second punch for Crabbe's benefit. Both boys collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads and moaning in pain. Though they'd always prided themselves on being among the toughest 11-year-olds at school, they were no match for a trained professional like Sherlock. Now, Sherlock's gaze drifted across the room, and settled on Mr. Malfoy's face went ashen, and he took an involuntary step back as Sherlock fixed him with a deceptively calm smile. "Mr. Malfoy," Sherlock drawled, "scion of a pure-blood family, care to have a go yourself?" In Draco's eyes, that smile was nothing short of demonic. He'd never expected one man to overwhelm Goyle and Crabbe single-handedly. No, to utterly crush them. This wasn't the work of a normal wizard. Losing every scrap of his earlier arrogance, Draco backed away again and bolted from the compartment. Crabbe and Goyle scrambled after him, eager to save what little dignity they had left. Sherlock didn't lift a finger to stop them. Harry and Ron watched in wide-eyed awe. Harry's heart pounded with admiration. Again, he found himself wishing he could trail Sherlock wherever he went. "That was incredible, Sherlock. How on earth did you manage that?" Harry asked, eyes wide. Sherlock shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. They were simply too weak. Back home, my family employed an instructor to teach me fencing and boxing. Boxing? Harry echoed in surprise. And fencing, Sherlock added as Ron frowned. Harry and Ron exchanged puzzled glances. A wizard who trained in hand-to-hand combat? They both pictured Sherlock holding his wand like a rapier, lunging through the air in a duel. It was a bizarre and oddly thrilling thought. Before either could comment further, Sherlock interrupted. Is mudblood a derogatory term? Harry blinked, then glanced at Ron. Ron's face went pale as he realized Sherlock didn't know. He leaned in and spoke softly. Yes, it's a horrible, vicious insult for a muggle-born witch or wizard. Only truly vile or irredeemable dark wizards would use it. I see. Sherlock's brow furrowed in thought. Does Mr. Malfoy use that word? Ron straightened, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. Not exactly, he said. Some Slytherins might, but Draco usually chooses his words more carefully, at least when he's in front of teachers. Sherlock nodded, processing the information. The game of social and magical etiquette at Hogwarts was proving to be as intricate as any crime scene he'd ever encountered. Yet something told him he'd master this world of spells and insults just as swiftly as he had learned to fence. Chapter 5. The House of Ambition. Malfoy's definitely going to Slytherin, Ron insisted, waving a hand toward the sorting hat perched on its stool. He pointed at the gleaming emerald and silver crest embroidered above the entrance. His family's pure blood, his father's history, there's no way the hat lets him anywhere else. Sherlock Holmes frowned, his dark brows knitting together in thought. He'd accompanied Harry and Ron to the sorting ceremony, rely out of scholarly curiosity. Hogwarts customs were a fascinating departure from the Muggle educational system. But the conversation with Ron now struck him as a puzzle worthy of deeper inquiry. Ron, I have 2 questions, Sherlock said calmly, folding his arms. Caught mid-gesture, Ron blinked. Shoot. First, Sherlock began, on what basis do you assert the sorting hat relies exclusively on bloodlines and family tradition? You mentioned pure blood ambition, but that hardly aligns with every sorting we've witnessed so far. I mean, well, Ron stammered, shifting on his feet. We've always thought that, haven't we? Pure bloods tend to land in Slytherin, half-bloods in Gryffindor or Ravenclaw, and Muggle-borns in Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw. It's tradition. Observation, not tradition, Sherlock corrected. An observation can be flawed. The hat evaluates personal qualities, courage, loyalty, ambition, wisdom, rather than pedigree, which brings me to my second question. Even if Malfoy's bloodline suggests Slytherin, why assume the hat's decision is irrevocable? It has, on occasion, taken the wearer's preference into account. Ron's mouth fell open. You mean it listens to them? Quite so, Sherlock said. He tapped his finger thoughtfully against the brim of his deerstalker. Potter, would you care to test my theory? Harry, standing beside him, grinned. I'll go first, he said, leading them forward in the line of first years. The older students waited in hushed excitement as Professor McGonagall called Harry's name. As Harry approached, the hat whispered directly into his mind. Ah, difficult, very difficult. Plenty of courage, not a bad mind either. There's talent, oh my goodness, yes, and a thirst to prove yourself. But where to put you? Harry's eyebrows shot up. Don't tell me, he murmured. Not a word, the hat whispered back. After a heartbeat, it announced, Gryffindor. The table of red and gold erupted in cheers. Sherlock leaned toward Ron. Notice that the hat considered Harry's own inclination. Now observe Malfoy. The ceremony proceeded until Draco Malfoy, pale and stiff-lipped, approached. He tapped the hat gingerly, as though it might bite. The moment it settled on his head, it proclaimed, Slytherin. A ripple of applause rose from the green and silver table. Draco inclined his head stiffly, returned to sit, and shot Harry a triumphant smirk. But did you hear what the hat said to him? Sherlock asked, raising an eyebrow dramatically. It said what? Ron demanded. Sherlock pressed his fingers to his temple as though replaying a recording. It remarked on his ambition, strong drive to succeed. Then it asked if he would make use of certain less savory talents. Malfoy was eager to say yes. Ron whitened. What sort of talents? Resourcefulness, cunning, the capacity to seize power, Sherlock explained. The hat's choice doesn't condemn him, but it does highlight qualities we might need to guide if we wish to steer him toward better decisions. Ron's defense of pure-blood destiny fell silent at that. Harry folded his arms, considering. So you're saying we shouldn't assume Malfoy's Slytherin choice dooms him to evil, only that he's got potential we need to watch? Exactly, Sherlock smiled. Ambition in itself is neither good nor bad. It all depends how one uses it. Now that we know the hat's criteria, we can better understand our classmates and perhaps influence them. Ron sighed, nodding reluctantly. All right, Holmes, I admit it, I was oversimplifying. Next time, I'll pay closer attention to what really matters. As the last first years settled, Sherlock leaned back, satisfied. A simple sorting ceremony had become a lesson in human nature, and a reminder that the most daunting puzzles often lie in the hearts of those around us. Chapter 17, Sherlock's Two Questions. All right, what's the issue? When Sherlock actually asked for Ron's help, Ron felt a surge of pride. Finally, the big shot needs me, he thought. Sherlock steepled his fingers under his chin and fixed Ron with a steady gaze. First, what defines each of the 4 Hogwarts houses? And second, surely you realize that the term muggle has a disparaging edge to it. Ron blinked. What? Disparaging? Muggle? He decided to tackle the second question first. Compared to sorting out the houses, the idea that muggle might be derogatory was a shock. Since childhood, Ron had never intended any insult when he used the word. His father, after all, was fascinated by the non-magical world and treated muggles with genuine warmth. It was only the staunch, pure-blood families, people like the Malfoys, who sneered at muggles, claiming they sullied the honor of the ancient sacred 28. But Sherlock was labeling muggle itself as contemptuous? That simply couldn't be right. Harry stood beside Ron in the Gryffindor common room, arms folded as Sherlock Holmes fixed them with that familiar, calculating stare. You're wrong this time, Sherlock, Harry said. Hagrid himself uses the term muggle. Sherlock shook his head wordlessly, his eyes never leaving them. After a moment's silence, he asked, Spell muggle. Ron glanced between them, mind racing. Before he could answer, Harry blurted out, M-U-G-G-L-E. Sherlock's brow creased. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Ron's heart pounded. Harry, too, had been entirely untroubled until Sherlock's question took hold. A tense pause fell over the room before Harry ventured, You mean the root word? Exactly. Sherlock's gaze sharpened on Ron. Don't wizarding families study how words are formed? Heat crept up Ron's neck. He cleared his throat. We do. Of course we do. I just didn't notice anything wrong with muggle. Sherlock exchanged a look with Harry, and Harry nodded ever so slightly. Stepping forward, Harry said, The root of muggle is mug. Ron's eyes widened, then narrowed in irritation. Struggling to keep his composure, he retorted, Mug? As in the drinking vessel? Harry couldn't hide a small smile. Sherlock merely raised an eyebrow in confirmation, and Ron's face went even redder. Harry sighed. Actually, mug in muggle doesn't just mean cup. It used to be slang for fool. At Sherlock's subtle nod, Harry turned to Ron. The root word mug wasn't only about drinking. It was an insult, calling someone gullible or stupid. Ron's jaw dropped, and he stood there speechless. He'd never heard that before. Harry bit back a smile. So much for the idea that wizarding families mastered every bit of vocabulary, and all the while, his respect for Sherlock deepened. Here was a boy who'd grown up entirely in the non-magical world, yet he understood it inside and out, excelled at boxing and fencing, and on top of that, wielded magic like a pro. Truly remarkable. Seeing how deflated Ron looked, Sherlock offered a reassuring squeeze to his friend's shoulder. Don't worry about it, he said. The insult was just mug, not muggle. The name still works perfectly fine. I'm pretty sure whoever coined that term didn't think kindly of non-magical folk. But, Ron began, frowning. Sherlock caught Ron's conflicted look and went on calmly. Language is always shifting. Words that start out neutral can take on hateful undertones over time. Consider Negro. It comes from Latin, simply meaning black, and was commonly used in the United States up until the 1960s without overtly insulting intent. The real slur was nigger. Yet today, Negro is just as unacceptable. Give it another few decades, and even black people might be deemed insensitive. Harry's eyes widened. So what should we call them then? Sherlock let out a short, dry laugh. Who can say? African-American, perhaps. It's much the same with muggle. What began as a pejorative has over time mellowed into an everyday term. Harry and Ron exchanged impressed glances. Sherlock really did know his linguistics. Just then, their compartment door slid open once more, and Hermione stepped in, her cloak dusted with train smoke. "What happened?" Hermione demanded, staring down at the sweet spilled across the floor. Harry and Ron exchanged glances with Sherlock. Sherlock shrugged. "Someone tried to steal our snacks," he reported coolly, "but they were eventually persuaded to leave." Hermione raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" she repeated, unconvinced. She'd just seen Malfoy and his two cronies striding away, and their smug expressions hardly suggested they'd been talked out of anything. "You didn't actually fight them, did you?" she asked, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "Don't tell me you got into trouble before even arriving." Ron's cheeks flushed, and he opened his mouth to snap back, but Sherlock cut in. "Ron, you haven't answered my first question." Ron blinked in surprise. Of the two questions Sherlock had posed, he'd only responded to the second. The realization made his ears burn. He always felt a step behind Sherlock's deductions. Still, as a Weasley, he prided himself on knowing the Hogwarts houses inside and out. Gathering his courage, he launched into an enthusiastic, if lengthy, explanation of Gryffindor, Slytherin, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw. Harry and Hermione both leaned forward, interest piqued. Hermione sank down beside Sherlock, her eyes bright with curiosity, determined to hear every last detail. Sherlock listened politely, but the more Ron described the four houses, the more he detected a strong undercurrent of bias in his new friend's words. "You've got to understand," Ron was saying. "Gryffindor is full of brave, noble warriors. After all, both the current principal and vice principal of Hogwarts were in Gryffindor, not to mention my mum, dad, and all my older brothers. I'm almost guaranteed to end up there myself." He puffed himself up at the thought. He went on without waiting for comment. "Ravenclaw? That's where all the bookish oddballs gather. You know the sort. Always buried in parchment, convinced they're the smartest people in the castle. Hufflepuffs are just friendly gourmands, obsessed with feasting rather than any real accomplishment." Ron shrugged. "Fair enough, I suppose, but everyone knows Slytherin is home to the most despicable lot. Shameless, cunning, downright scheming villains." Sherlock's sharp mind went to work. Based on Ron's family connections, he could see why Gryffindor might feel superior. To an outsider, though, their bravery might look more like reckless hot-headedness that led to endless trouble. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. At that moment, Harry, who had been silently observing from the window seat, chimed in. "Hagrid once told me he'd rather be in Hufflepuff than Slytherin." "Because he's afraid of Voldemort?" Sherlock asked with casual precision. The name of the Dark Lord made Ron flinch. He shot Sherlock a resentful glare, his expression twisted between anger and fear. Even in these early hours on the Hogwarts Express, tensions were already rising, and Sherlock couldn't help but wonder how deep they would run once the Sorting Hat made its decision. "I know you're not frightened, but do you have to disregard our feelings?" Hermione protested softly, though her cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. Sherlock merely raised an eyebrow. He never much cared about other people's opinions. After Harry gave him a quiet nod, Sherlock turned to Ron and asked, "Of the four houses, which do you think has the most students? Hufflepuff?" Ron stared at him, wide-eyed. "How on earth did you guess that?" he blurted. Then, with a grin, he added, "By Merlin's beard, you really are amazing." Sherlock inclined his head slightly. It made perfect sense. The rowdiest, most troublesome students had been scattered among Gryffindor, Slytherin, and Ravenclaw, leaving Hufflepuff with all the well-behaved, dutiful sorts. Just then, the Hogwarts Express's tannoy crackled to life. "Attention, please. We will be arriving at Hogwarts in 5 min. Utes, kindly leave your trunks on board. We will see to their delivery at the castle." With a decisive nod, Sherlock sprang into motion. "Come on, why are you just standing there?" Hermione's face went bright red at his brisk urgency, and she hurriedly stepped back to join the others. Chapter 18. Arrival at Hogwarts. "It was just me taking off her coat," Ron muttered, watching Hermione hurry away with a bright flush in her cheeks. "Well, at least she's out of the way." Harry and Ron quickly slipped into their robes, following Sherlock's example. Ron's worn sneakers peeked out from beneath the hem of his cloak, just as Sherlock had predicted, but right now, no one paid them much mind. Both boys looked pale and uneasy. They were only 11 years old. suddenly whisked far from home and thrust into a world they barely understood. Who could blame them for feeling nervous? Sherlock himself was scarcely more at ease, if one could even think of him as a child. Having only recently recovered from a serious illness, he was particularly sensitive to the damp chill that clung to the night air. As the train slowed to a halt, darkness pressed in on all sides. When the doors slid open, a gust of cold, wiry wind swept through the compartment. The young wizards all shivered. Even Sherlock, whose health had strengthened remarkably, found the sudden blast of British dampness almost intolerable. For a moment, silence reigned as they each braced themselves against the cold. Then, gathering their courage and their belongings, they stepped off the train and into the mist-shrouded world of Hogwarts. A soft glow suddenly appeared overhead, drawing the first year's eyes upward. A gruff voice called out through the trees, "First years, over here!" Steps crunched on the undergrowth, and then a towering figure loomed into view, over 10 feet tall, lantern held high. Sherlock recognized him at once from Harry's stories, Rubeus Hagrid. In person, the half-giant was even larger than Harry had described, easily 3.5 meters tall, dwarfing any muggle you might meet. Despite the wild beard framing his face, Hagrid's grin was as gentle as a summer morning. "Harry, right this way. Any more first years? Mind your footing now. This path's a bit tricky. Okay, everyone, follow me." Under Hagrid's broad lantern light, the first years peeled off from the older students and descended a narrow, winding trail. The trees closed in, their branches knitting together overhead so that only Hagrid's lantern pierced the gloom. Then, around the next bend, the path opened up, and every newcomer stopped in their tracks. A collective gasp echoed through the hush as their eyes fell on the breathtaking sight before them. A broad sweep of inky water stretched out before them, as if the very clouds had parted to reveal a hidden realm. The surface of the Black Lake lay calm, its gentle ripples lending an air of hushed mystery. Across the water, a great mountain rose into the night sky, crowned by a stately castle whose dozens of spires pierced the heavens. Tiny lights winked from its windows like distant stars. Hogwarts at last. A reverent silence fell over the first years. Eyes wide, breaths held, they gazed in awe until a familiar rumble shattered the stillness. "To honor our 4 founders," Hagrid boomed, "all first years must make their first crossing in boats, just as they did when they built Hogwarts." He swung his enormous umbrella, motioning them forward. Each little craft could carry no more than 4 passengers. Harry and Ron slipped into the boat carrying their older brother Sherlock, whom they'd met before term began, and Hermione climbed in beside them, earning an exasperated eye-roll from Ron. "Everyone aboard?" Hagrid called, nudging the boat with a great shove. The oars dipped into the water, and with a gentle lurch, they were off, gliding toward the castle's gleaming walls and the adventures awaiting them beyond its gates. "Forward!" Hagrid's thunderous call echoed across the lake. Once he'd confirmed that every first year was on board, he clambered into his own boat. There simply wasn't room for anyone else beside that giant frame, and rowed toward the castle looming in the morning mist. Behind him, a procession of smaller boats cut through the glassy water, each ripple sending tiny waves breaking against the hulls. Some of the Nini, with students sat in awed silence, gazing at the towering turrets that seemed to disappear into the clouds. Others bent to their oars, eager to speed ahead. The rest chattered excitedly about what awaited them. Sherlock slipped into a boat with Harry, Hermione, and Ron. It was Hermione who broke the quiet first. "How do they decide which house we'll be in?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Harry shrugged. "Hagrid didn't say." Sherlock flipped through his mental notes, and the handful of guidebooks he'd managed to buy, none mentioned the sorting procedure. It was as if everyone agreed to keep it under wraps. The 3 of them turned to Ron, who sat blinking under 6 pairs of expectant eyes. He swallowed and hurried to explain. "There's some kind of test," he said, cheeks pink. "Fred said it's pretty painful, but I reckon he's joking." Sherlock shook his head firmly. "No way. It's just an entrance exam, like a placement test in the Muggle world. I can't imagine it hurting anyone." Ron hovered anxiously at the prow of the little boat. "I hope I'll get Gryffindor. But speaking of which, Sherlock, someone as clever as you'll end up in Ravenclaw for sure. Me? Gryffindor all the way." Hermione raised an eyebrow at Ron's confident claim. Sherlock only offered a small, knowing smile and stayed silent. The crossing of the Black Lake proved quicker than anyone had expected. As the boats scraped against the shore, Hagrid scrambled about, guiding the vessels away. He even spotted Neville's lost toad nestled in some reeds and triumphantly returned it to a delighted Neville, an exchange that lifted Neville's spirits immediately. But the moment didn't last. At the castle's great iron gates stood a tall witch in emerald robes, dark hair caught up neatly under her pointed hat. Hagrid approached her and announced, "First years, Professor McGonagall." "Thank you, Hagrid," the witch replied crisply. "I'll take it from here." Her stern expression swallowed Hagrid's friendly warmth, and every new student felt a shiver of uncertainty. This was Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts and head of Gryffindor House. Professor McGonagall's gaze swept the line of first years, lingering just long enough to unsettle them, then brightened when she reached Sherlock. A rare, warm smile softened her features. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Good evening, Professor McGonagall," Sherlock replied with a slight bow. Nearby students whispered in astonishment. Even here, on their very first night at Hogwarts, Sherlock Holmes's reputation preceded him. Hermione leaned across the table and tapped Sherlock on the arm. "Holmes, how do you know Professor McGonagall?" Sherlock met her bright, inquisitive gaze with a small smile. Her friendly curiosity reminded him of just how warm first years could be. Catching Harry and Ron watching him, he answered quietly, "She stopped by earlier to help answer some of our questions about Hogwarts." "I see," Ron said, nodding as understanding dawned on his face. At that moment, Professor McGonagall cleared her throat, and the chatter in the hall immediately died down. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she began, her voice ringing clear. "Our start-of-term feast will commence shortly in the Great Hall, but before we take our seats, each of you must be sorted into your houses." Her overview was calm, fair, and impeccably balanced, quite unlike Ron's enthusiastic, occasionally biased descriptions. She spoke of Gryffindor's courage, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Ravenclaw's wit, and Slytherin's ambition, pointing out that each house boasted a proud history and outstanding wizards. "No house is superior or inferior," she emphasized. "Wherever you are placed, you are an essential part of Hogwarts." With that, Professor McGonagall led the first-year students into the glittering Great Hall and then slipped away to make final preparations for the sorting ceremony. Hardly had she vanished than the castle walls seemed to come alive. Over 20 ghosts emerged in slow, drifting processions, moaning, gesturing, and filling the hall with an otherworldly glow. A chorus of startled shrieks went up from the first years as they huddled together, caught between awe and alarm at Hogwarts's resident spirits. Sherlock found himself inexplicably drawn to the ghosts drifting through the corridors, phenomena that lay far beyond the reach of contemporary science. He stepped forward, voice low and measured, attempting to engage them. But the specters were deep in hushed conversation, paying no heed to the cluster of first-year students. Only the fat friar paused, his translucent robes swaying as he floated nearer. "I do hope you're sorted into Hufflepuff," the cheerful spirit said. "I served that house in my day." Sherlock raised a single eyebrow. "There's no causal connection there," he observed dryly. With a polite nod to the friar, he abandoned his seance. A moment later, he turned away and cast his gaze across the cavernous expanse of the Great Hall, curiosity already shifting to what lay ahead. "Are you here to buy a hat?" called a stout vendor as Sherlock and Hermione passed through the castle gates. Sherlock hardly heard him. The towering walls of Hogwarts loomed so dark and forbidding that he had braced himself for a cramped, oppressive interior. Instead, the Great Hall was breathtaking. Rows of long tables stretched away beneath an enchanted ceiling that perfectly mimicked the night sky. Stars twinkled overhead in silent, magical harmony, as though the roof had vanished altogether. Sherlock stared upward, unconvinced there was any solid structure above them. Hermione leaned closer and whispered, "It's a spell." The ceiling was charmed by the founders to look exactly like the sky outside. "I read about it in Hogwarts, a history." Sherlock nodded. The hall felt impossibly vast, far larger than the castle's exterior dimensions would allow. No logical explanation could account for it. Here, magic filled every gap that science left behind. At that moment, Professor McGonagall returned to her place at the staff table. The ghosts, floating spectral figures, drifted through the walls and vanished as though summoned by her arrival. Silence fell over the assembled students and teachers. Every pair of eyes turned to the dais, waiting for the sorting ceremony to begin. All eyes were fixed on Professor McGonagall as she set a small, four-legged stool before the new first years and placed the ancient sorting hat atop it. Sherlock couldn't help but notice how worn and patched the hat was. Even from a distance, its faded fabric looked caked with grime. Then, without warning, the hat twitched. A jagged slit opened near its brim, like a mouth preparing to speak, and it burst into song. "You may think I'm ugly, but never judge by my cover. If you find a prettier sorting hat, I'll eat myself, my brother." The tune was scratchy and off-key, worse than Sherlock's own amateur violin playing, but it served its purpose. Through its ramshackle melody, the hat offered a succinct, unbiased introduction to Hogwarts' four houses, far more professional than any lecture. Gryffindor, bold and courageous, symbolized by the lion and the element of fire. Hufflepuff, just and loyal, represented by the badger and the element of earth. Ravenclaw, wise and scholarly, its emblem the soaring eagle, its element the wind. Slytherin, shrewd and ambitious, its emblem the sleek serpent, its element water. By now, the first-year students had grasped the routine. When their turn came, all they had to do was slip on the sorting hat and await their fate. "I'm going to kill Fred," Ron muttered, half in exasperation, half in amusement, as he leaned toward Sherlock and Harry. "He made it sound like I was about to duel a troll." Harry and Hermione exchanged relieved glances. Both had been on edge just moments ago. Sherlock, for his part, was entirely unruffled. To him, the ceremony was simply growing more entertaining by the second. Professor McGonagall stepped forward from the staff table, parchment in hand. Her clear voice rang out across the great hall. "Hannah Abbott!" All eyes turned as a small girl with golden braids wobbled out of the line. She approached the sorting hat, cheeks flushed, and tucked the brim over her eyes. After a heartbeat that felt much longer, the hat's voice echoed, "Hufflepuff!" A cheer went up from the table on the right. Students pounded the benches in applause, welcoming Hannah to her new house. Even the fat friar, Hufflepuff's resident ghost, drifted forward in a jovial wave before giving her a friendly thumbs up. With that, the sorting ceremony continued, each name a promise of new friendships, rivalries, and adventures to come. One by one, Professor McGonagall called the new students' names. Each stepped forward, placed the sorting hat on their head, listened to it declare their house, and then removed it, methodical, almost ritualistic. Nothing felt surprising anymore. Then McGonagall called the name Sherlock had been waiting for. "Hermione Granger!" Heart-pounding. Hermione forgot even to bow as Sherlock hurried to the stool. She tugged the hat down over her ears and sat trembling as the hall fell silent. Minutes ticked by, nearly 4 full minutes, before the hat finally boomed. "Gryffindor!" A ripple of applause followed, but Ron Weasley let out a disgruntled snort. He shot Hermione a half-annoyed, half-relieved look, clearly bothered that she might be in his own house. Sherlock, however, watched the whole exchange with clinical interest. He wasn't curious about Ron's reaction. He was tracking the hat's timing. Some students were sorted in an instant, while others kept the hat debating for what felt like ages. Hermione's 4-minute wait was the longest yet. Now a new question occupied his mind. When it was his turn, how long would the sorting hat take? And more importantly, which house would he end up in? By the time the sorting hat began its jaunty little tune, Sherlock had already run the probabilities through his mind, and the outcome was clear. He could end up anywhere. Courage he possessed in abundance. After all, his very reason for coming to Hogwarts was the thrill of the unknown, the adrenaline rush that came from teetering on the edge of danger. When the stakes were high, even life and death barely gave him pause. If anything, they heightened his excitement. Integrity, too, was a part of his nature. Crime fighting wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. His methods might not always fit neatly into the Ministry's rulebooks, but they were never malicious, and they always delivered justice in the end. Wisdom was practically his birthright. Though as a boy he'd once convinced himself he was dull by comparing his talents to other children's, he knew better now. Then there was ambition and cunning, qualities that practically dripped from him. The hat's own song had made it clear that his audacity and defiance of convention were tailor-made for Slytherin. Putting it all together, even Sherlock's razor-sharp logic couldn't pin down a single house. Gryffindor, sure, he had the guts. Hufflepuff, in a way, his sense of justice and loyalty. Ravenclaw, obviously, he was cunning and knowledgeable. And Slytherin, undeniably, he was driven, resourceful, and more than a little proud. He would have loved to ask Hermione how things had unfolded when she'd worn the hat, but there was no opportunity now, and no guarantee she'd hand him the inside story. So he settled insolently onto the stool, steeling himself for whatever verdict awaited him. Each time a new student was sorted, they slipped away from the central group to join their housemates, older students who stood ready to welcome them. Professor McGonagall glanced up and saw Hermione nestled among the Gryffindors, exchanging smiles and nods. She returned her attention to the parchment, her finger tracing the next name. After a moment's pause, she looked up and announced clearly, "Sherlock Holmes." Sherlock remained motionless, expression unreadable. But Harry and Ron tensed in their seats, hearts pounding. "Not Slytherin," Harry whispered urgently. "Gryffindor, please," Ron muttered under his breath. All around them, heads turned. Word of Sherlock's astonishing display on the train, how he'd outwitted Malfoy and his cronies, had already spread through Hogwarts. Add to that his sharp features and intense gaze, and it was no wonder every curious eye was fixed on him now. Rumor even had it that Professor McGonagall had singled him out for Dumbledore's attention, praising his keen analytical mind. Yet in that hushed moment, no one but the Sorting Hat itself could say where Sherlock Holmes would belong. Sherlock strode up to the wooden stool, but paused before placing the Sorting Hat on his head. Instead, he lifted it into his hands, turning it slowly, inspecting every fold and stitch as though it were a priceless relic. A collective gasp rippled through the great hall. Professors and first-years alike froze in astonishment. Professor McGonagall, who was presiding over the ceremony, halted mid-sentence, her eyebrows arching in surprise. In all her years at Hogwarts, she had never seen a student treat the Sorting Hat this way. He certainly wasn't here to buy one, so why was he examining it as if selecting fine parchment? Casting a sharp glance toward the head table, she caught Dumbledore's serene gaze and silently pleaded for an explanation. Chapter 20. I'm so miserable. I'm so miserable. Sherlock paused at the entrance to the Great Hall, the ancient Sorting Hat held gingerly in his hands. Professor McGonagall and Professor Dumbledore exchanged curious glances. Even without a word, Dumbledore's slight lean forward and narrowed gaze made it clear he too was intrigued, but neither dared interrupt. Sherlock gently stroked the hat's frayed brim, lifting its corners as if inspecting a curious artifact. At last he sighed and, with a decisive motion, plopped it onto his head. Even from a distance, it was obvious this hat had seen better centuries. Its fabric was grimy, matted with grease, and faintly redolent of hair oil. Sherlock, whose own standards of cleanliness could be called flexible, felt a flicker of surprise at the wizarding world's approach to hygiene. "Ugh," he muttered under his breath. "The last wearer must have been." A soft, disembodied voice sounded in his ear. "I'm sorry if I've offended you. I'm only a hat. I can't very well clean myself." Sherlock started. Then his eyes brightened. "Wait, how did you know the previous student was the baker's son?" The hat chuckled, a dry, rustling sound of old fabric. "You were wondering, so I answered. Now don't fret, we'll be done soon." Sherlock suppressed a grin. He had expected the hat to sort him, not converse so candidly. Mind-reading, it seemed, was part of the service as well. In that moment, beneath the vaulted ceilings and flickering torchlight of Hogwarts, Sherlock Holmes realized once again the magical world was every bit as extraordinary as he'd been told. And now, it was about to decide his house. No, nothing more than surface thoughts, and only if you're not deliberately hiding them. I'm no dark arts artifact, and I don't possess legilimency. The Sorting Hat hesitated, then pressed again. "So, will you answer my question now?" Sherlock regarded the hat with mild amusement. Intrigued by its persistence, and by the hat itself, he indulged it. "A simple deduction. Your brim is dusted with white flour and flecked with tin foil, and there's a faint wheat scent masking hair oil. Clearly, your previous owner came from a baker's household. These details merely confirm what his manner already suggested." "Fascinating! Brilliant, the Hat exclaimed, brimming with delight. Unparalleled wisdom, admirable courage, a kind heart, and that bold streak of rule-breaking. To defy authority and challenge restrictions, you have the makings of greatness. In Slytherin, one thought from you would secure glory beyond doubt. And yet consider Ravenclaw, a thirst for knowledge, a love of research, an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. Your sharp mind and perceptive eyes would flourish there. But tell me, do you wish to punish evil and champion good? Is your calling to fight crime? The Sorting Hat fell silent, waiting for Sherlock's answer. The great hall fell into a hushed silence as the sorting ceremony reached its most anticipated moment. Atop a boy with a long, aquiline nose sat the ancient Sorting Hat, its brim quivering with indecision. "Oh, what a pity," the Hat murmured after an interminable pause. "If Lady Hufflepuff were still with us, she would have adored you." A collective breath was held by everyone present as the Hat continued. "But your unwavering, fiery courage, yes, that is far more compelling. If I don't place you in Gryffindor, Professor McGonagall will surely have my head." The boy inclined his head slightly, meeting the Hat's unseen gaze with calm assurance. "I suppose I'm a difficult one to classify." Silence pressed in again. Then, in that stillness, he added, "Bravery is, after all, the best substitute for foolishness." At once, the Sorting Hat seemed to brighten. Thus began a cordial, even animated, exchange between boy and brim, an intimate debate, audible only to them. Throughout the hall, students and teachers leaned forward, hanging on every word. Several of the older girls, struck by his refined features and composed demeanor, secretly scribbled down his name, Sherlock Holmes. Outside, excited murmurs swelled in the corridors, but Sherlock remained entirely engrossed in conversation with the Hat, utterly indifferent to the growing buzz. "What do I see?" the Hat asked, chuckling softly. "Boldness, daring, qualities that could shape a hero." Sherlock allowed a faint, wry smile to touch his lips. "Let's not make heroes of anyone. Heroes don't exist, and even if they did, I'm not one of them. But, emotionalism is a physiological defect of failures. Intelligence is the new sexy." The Sorting Hat had never faced such a dilemma. In theory, this young wizard bore the traits of all four houses: bravery, wit, loyalty, and cunning. Any could claim him, yet none felt quite right. Through its conversation with Sherlock Holmes, the Hat had come to lean toward either Gryffindor or Ravenclaw. Sherlock himself had declared, "Intelligence is the new sexy," tipping the scales toward Ravenclaw. Yet, just as the Hat was about to pronounce its verdict, a troubling realization struck. Sherlock would only absorb and retain knowledge that served his immediate purposes. He treated learning as a tool, not a pursuit of wisdom for its own sake, an approach at odds with Ravenclaw's cherished values of curiosity, scholarship, and the joy of discovery. On anyone else, this quirk might be a minor matter. But with Sherlock's razor-sharp mind and single-minded pragmatism, it mattered greatly. The Hat sighed to itself, weighing every possibility. Gryffindor prized courage and a certain disregard for convention, qualities Sherlock displayed when he confronted danger or cracked an impossible case. Ravenclaw prized intellectual rigor, but Sherlock's utilitarian view of knowledge hinted at a lack of reverence for learning as an end in itself. Hufflepuff prized loyalty and fairness, traits Sherlock often bypassed if they interfered with the truth. Slytherin prized ambition and resourcefulness, attributes Sherlock possessed in abundance, but mixed with an aversion to the political maneuvering that so many Slytherins embraced. As the Hat deliberated, Sherlock sat perfectly still, his mind racing. He heard every thread of thought, the Hat's curiosity, its hesitation, the faint thrill it felt at such a rare mind before it. Finally, the Hat spoke. "You're a calculating, brilliant young man, aren't you? You prize logic above all, sometimes to your detriment. You'll push boundaries and flout rules if it leads you to answers. There's courage there, too, but tempered by restraint, not recklessness. You crave usefulness in your knowledge, yet you're not content with the mundane. You need challenge." Sherlock's eyes gleamed. The Sorting Hat paused a heartbeat longer. Then it declared, "Better be Slytherin." Silence fell for a moment. Sherlock's eyebrows rose in mild surprise. Then he smiled the first genuine, amused smile the Hat had ever heard. "Slytherin," he repeated, testing the word. "Intriguing." And with that, Sherlock Holmes strode toward the Slytherin table, his mind already calculating the mysteries Hogwarts would soon reveal, and how he might use them. Sherlock regarded knowledge purely as a tool. He absorbed only what served a purpose and disregarded the rest, whereas true Ravenclaws thirsted simply for learning's own sake. By contrast, his courage was beyond reproach. He welcomed danger as an opportunity for discovery, and his bold spirit swept away every obstacle in its path. As he liked to say, bravery is the best substitute for folly. Fortunately for him, genuine fearlessness was never in short supply. Ravenclaws, with their heads bent over books, seldom had time to join him on daring exploits. But Gryffindor, home of the lion-hearted, offered companions who lived for adventure and were always eager to tag along. Then the Sorting Hat whispered of Ravenclaw's wealth of knowledge bases, students who hoarded facts and lore. Sherlock's eyes glittered with excitement. Here, he thought, was a ready-made network of informants. He could summon an swears on demand without wasting hours poring over textbooks, leaving him free to chase real mysteries. With that in mind, Sherlock made his choice. The Sorting Hat, honoring his strategy as well as his zeal, placed him exactly where he wanted to be. Sherlock stepped forward as the Sorting Hat murmured to itself, and then shouted, "Gryffindor!" He lifted the hat, gave it a polite nod, and made his way to the long scarlet and gold table amid cheers and applause. Hermione Granger leapt to her feet, beaming. "Sherlock!" Before she could finish, two fiery-haired brothers with impish grins barged in front of him. Fred and George Weasley, notorious pranksters and Hermione's classmates, flanked Sherlock on his way to the bench. "We were just saying Miss Granger nearly caused a hat stall," Fred proclaimed dramatically, "and then the real hat staller turns up." "A hat stall?" Sherlock raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. George smirked. "It's when the Sorting Hat sits there blinking at you because it can't decide which house you belong to." Fred leaned closer. "Poor thing just panics. Totally flummoxed." "Honestly," George added, "we've seen it happen. It's a right waste of time." "Enough," snapped a stern voice. Percy Weasley, the twins' eldest brother and Gryffindor prefect, rubbed his temples as he pushed back stray hairs. He gave Sherlock a quick, apologetic nod. "Ignore them. They've been causing mayhem all over Hogwarts since term began." Earlier that morning in Diagon Alley, Percy had purchased a copy of How Prefects Maintain Order. The book's first rule was clear: prefects must set a proper example for new students. Percy fully intended to uphold that mandate, even if it meant keeping his own brothers in line. "Welcome to Gryffindor," he said quietly to Sherlock. "Now sit before the feast starts." Sherlock nodded in thanks and slipped into the seat beside Hermione. Fred and George exchanged triumphant high fives behind him, while Percy let out an exasperated sigh, bracing himself for a very long year. He then explained the official meaning of a hat stall to Sherlock and properly introduced himself.